I am going to tell you the story of Otis Elwood Toole, a man who drifted through life like a shadow, carrying with him the scars of abuse, poverty, and neglect, and leaving behind a trail of horror, unanswered questions, and devastating pain. His life was not one of grand schemes or intricate manipulations, but of chaos, confusion, and violence. He was a killer who confessed and retracted, who blurred the line between truth and lies, who may have taken many lives but left the world never fully certain of what he had actually done. And that uncertainty, that emptiness, is what makes his story one of the most haunting in the history of American true crime. Otis Toole was born on March 5th, 1947, in Jacksonville, Florida, into a world that seemed set against him from the start. His father was an alcoholic who abandoned the family when Otis was still a boy, leaving him in the care of a mother who was harsh, cold, and abusive. She dressed him in girls' clothing to humiliate him, beat him, and reminded him constantly that he was unwanted. His grandmother, according to Toole, practiced forms of ritualistic religion that terrified him as a child. He would later claim that she exposed him to occult practices, strange ceremonies, and even encouraged him to take part in rituals that blurred innocence and fear. These claims, like much of what Toole later said in life, are impossible to fully confirm, but they paint the picture of a boy who was never safe, never comforted, and never allowed to feel loved. He was different from the beginning, slow in school, subject to epileptic seizures, and often bullied by other children. He was isolated from his peers. He wandered the streets of Jacksonville, often disappearing for days. Fire fascinated him. He would set small blazes and watch them burn, staring into the flames with a fascination that was both soothing and arousing. Later, psychiatrists would describe him as having pyrophilia, a sexual attraction to fire. By the time he was 10, he was already setting homes and abandoned buildings alight, finding in destruction a twisted sense of control. Sexuality confused and troubled him from an early age. He was molested by older men and admitted to trading sexual acts for money as a teenager. His earliest sexual experiences were marked not by tenderness or choice, but by exploitation and coercion. As he grew older, he began to identify as gay. But in the South of the 1950s and 1960s, this only brought him more isolation, ridicule, and violence. Otis was a boy without belonging, too poor for stability, too strange for acceptance, and too damaged for comfort. His teenage years were marked by drifting, petty crimes, and violence. He would later claim that he killed for the first time as a teenager, stabbing a traveling salesman who had propositioned him. Whether this story is true remains unknown, but it marked the beginning of a pattern that would define the rest of his life. Confessions of murder that could never be proven. Sometimes he told the truth, sometimes he lied, and sometimes he blurred the two until no one could tell the difference. By adulthood, Otis was a drifter moving through the South without direction. He was transient, unstable, and unpredictable. He worked odd jobs, slept in bus stations or abandoned buildings, and wandered highways. It was during these years of drifting that he met another man who would change the course of his life. Henry Lee Lucas. Lucas, like Toole, was born into neglect and abuse. He, too, had grown up violent, unstable, and alienated. When the two men met in the mid-1970s, they seemed to recognize themselves in each other. They became companions, lovers at times, partners in drifting, and, as they would both later claim, partners in killing. The pair became infamous for their confessions, at one point admitting to hundreds of murders across the country. They painted themselves as nomadic killers, traveling state to state, murdering strangers picked up along the highways, and then moving on without a trace. To hear them tell it, they were among the most prolific killers in history. The problem was that most of those confessions could not be verified. Some were proven false, with Lucas and Toole confessing to murders they could not possibly have committed because they were in another state at the time. Yet, their words were so detailed, so graphic, and so consistent with each other that investigators struggled to separate fact from fiction. For a time, police departments across the country were eager to pin unsolved murders on the duo, closing cases based on confessions that were shaky at best. Later, this rush to believe would be criticized as sloppy police work. But in the moment, Toole and Lucas seemed to provide answers to mysteries that had haunted communities for years. Amid the sea of confessions, however, there were confirmed crimes that showed Toole's capacity for violence. In January 1982, he killed a man named George Sonnenberg by setting fire to his home while Sonnenberg was inside. Toole had been living with Sonnenberg at the time and set the blaze after an argument. Sonnenberg died of his injuries, and Toole was eventually convicted of the murder. He was later convicted of the murder of a 64-year-old woman named Dorothy Burkett, whom he strangled, and another murder in Tallahassee. These convictions proved that, even if many of his confessions were lies or exaggerations, Otis Toole was a killer. But it was one case in particular that forever tied his name to American memory: the abduction and murder of Adam Walsh. On July 27, 1981, 6-year-old Adam Walsh disappeared from a Sears department store in Hollywood, Florida. His mother had left him briefly at a video game display while she shopped, and when she returned, he was gone. 2 weeks later, his severed head was found in a drainage canal more than 100 miles away. The murder shocked the nation. It was brutal, senseless, and left parents across America terrified for their children. Adam's father, John Walsh, would channel his grief into activism, becoming the host of America's Most Wanted and one of the most vocal advocates for missing children's rights in U.S. history. Years later, Otis Toole confessed multiple times to killing Adam Walsh. He said he lured the boy into his car, drove him away, and murdered him. He described details of the crime in a way that seemed convincing. Yet, as always with Toole, the truth was tangled. He later recanted. Then he confessed again. Police discovered that his car at the time matched witness descriptions, and bloodstains found inside were consistent with Adam's. But the investigation was botched. The car was lost. Evidence was mishandled. For decades, the case remained officially unsolved, even as Toole's confessions continued to haunt the Walsh family. Finally, in 2008, long after Toole's death, police declared the case closed, naming him as Adam's killer. John Walsh accepted the conclusion, but with the bitter knowledge that certainty had been denied to him for decades. Otis Toole spent his later years in prison, serving life sentences for his confirmed murders. His health deteriorated. He developed cirrhosis of the liver, contracted AIDS, and grew weaker as the years passed. In 1996, at the age of 49, he died in prison, a man who had lived in chaos and died in obscurity. Next story, I'm going to tell you the story of Lonnie Franklin Jr., a man who moved quietly through the streets of Los Angeles for decades, unseen and unnoticed, hiding a darkness that would haunt the city for years. He was not the kind of killer who acted out in public fits of rage, nor was he flamboyant or attention-seeking. He was patient, meticulous, and careful, blending into a bustling metropolis while preying on some of its most vulnerable residents. His story is one of duality, a man who could be a father, a neighbor, a community member, and at the same time a predator whose actions left families shattered, the city fearful, and investigators baffled. It is a story of patience, evil hidden behind ordinariness, and the devastating consequences of societal blind spots. Lonnie Franklin Jr. was born on August 30th, 1952, in Los Angeles, into a city that would both shape him and conceal him. His early life was not easy. He grew up in a working-class household, part of a family navigating the difficulties of urban poverty. From a young age, he displayed traits that would later emerge as troubling: introversion, social withdrawal, and occasional irritability. He struggled in school, often isolated from peers, and found himself drawn to solitary activities that allowed him to escape the world around him. There were no overt signs that he would become a serial killer, but the seeds of his darkness were already present in the combination of early life stressors, exposure to crime in his environment, and a mind that seemed increasingly detached from empathy. As a young man, Franklin lived like many in his community, taking jobs when he could, raising a family, and attempting to maintain a normal life. He married and had children, moving through the ordinary rhythms of adulthood. attending community events, paying bills, and interacting with neighbors who knew him only as a quiet man who did not stand out. He appeared entirely ordinary, the kind of man you would never suspect of harboring a deadly compulsion. Yet while he fulfilled these social roles, he was simultaneously planning, stalking, and killing. The dichotomy between his public persona and private life is one of the most chilling aspects of his story, and it allowed him to commit murders without detection for decades. Franklin's first known murders began in the mid-1980s. He targeted women who were marginalized, many of whom were involved in sex work, struggled with addiction, or lived in neighborhoods where law enforcement attention was minimal. He would identify these women, follow their routines, and strike when they were isolated. His methods were simple yet terrifyingly effective. He relied on physical control, often using binding or strangulation to overpower his victims. Bodies were disposed of in alleys, vacant lots, dumpsters, and abandoned properties, sometimes left visible to send a chilling message, other times hidden to delay discovery. Investigators at the time did not immediately connect these killings. The women came from neighborhoods that were under-policed, their disappearances often seen as part of a larger social problem rather than a targeted pattern of murder. The early victims' deaths were cataloged as individual homicides, and the full scale of Franklin's crimes remained invisible. To the families of the victims, the loss was incomprehensible. They were left navigating grief, uncertainty, and the frustration of unanswered questions. For Franklin, the invisibility was protective. His careful blending into the social fabric of Los Angeles allowed him to continue killing without fear of exposure. By the late 1980s, Franklin had gained experience in his methods. His killing became routine in a way that was chillingly methodical. He would identify vulnerable women, gain their trust, lure them to his home or another secluded location, and kill them with minimal noise or resistance. Afterward, he would meticulously dispose of their bodies, sometimes returning to scenes to ensure they were hidden. His patience was remarkable. Unlike many killers whose compulsion drives them to act in bursts, Franklin had a slow, calculated rhythm. This earned him the nickname Grim Sleeper, not only because of the pause in his crimes from 1988 to 2002, but because of his ability to sleep through years without detection, then re-emerge as a killer again. The long pause in activity puzzled investigators. For more than a decade, Franklin's killings seemed to stop, only to resume in the early 2000s. This period of inactivity allowed him to further embed himself in his community, maintain employment, and continue his facade as a law-abiding citizen. During these years, he presented as a normal father, a caring relative, and a quiet presence in the neighborhoods he lived in. It was a duality that fascinated and horrified criminologists. A man capable of extreme violence while maintaining a convincing, ordinary life. When Franklin resumed killing in the early 2000s, the pattern became clearer. Investigators began to connect the deaths through emerging forensic technologies, particularly DNA profiling. Each new victim matched previous patterns. Women vulnerable due to poverty, substance use, or social isolation, killed in the same manner, and often left in similar locations. The investigation into these murders grew more sophisticated, combining community outreach, forensic science, and persistent police work. Still, the scale of Franklin's crimes was staggering, and the realization that he had operated undetected for decades shocked the city and the nation. Franklin's arrest came in 2010, sparked by DNA evidence linking him to multiple murders. During questioning, he initially denied guilt, but investigators had built an overwhelming case. Evidence included physical traces at crime scenes, patterns in victimology, and corroboration of his movements over decades. Families of victims were called to testify, sharing harrowing accounts of women lost to senseless violence. Each story added weight to the understanding of Franklin's reign of terror and revealed the human cost of systemic neglect. The trial that followed was lengthy and emotionally intense. Prosecutors meticulously reconstructed decades of killings, presenting evidence of Franklin's methods, his victims' lives, and his ability to exist in two worlds at once. Testimonies revealed not only the acts themselves, but the societal failures that allowed them to go undetected for so long. Police resource limitations, social stigmas against sex workers, and the marginalization of communities where the victims lived. Franklin's defense attempted to mitigate by claiming detachment and mental instability, yet the jury found him guilty of 10 counts of murder. He was sentenced to death, a verdict that offered families some closure but could never erase the pain of decades-long terror. Franklin spent the remaining years of his life on death row, declining in health, a man whose crimes would leave a permanent mark on Los Angeles. He died in 2020 from natural causes, but the shadow of his actions lingered. Neighborhoods, families, and law enforcement agencies had to reconcile with the reality that a predator had lived among them, unseen for decades, exploiting blind spots and preying on the most vulnerable. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of Rodney Alcala, a man who lived among the people of Southern California, a photographer and aspiring actor whose charm and apparent normalcy masked a horrifying secret. To most who met him, he seemed polite, even likable, a man with ambition and social grace. He carried himself confidently, appeared well-spoken, and presented himself as successful. Yet behind this carefully constructed exterior was a predator of astonishing cunning, a man whose crimes were as methodical as they were brutal, and whose ability to hide in plain sight would allow him to terrorize communities for years. Rodney Alcala's story is one of deception, obsession, and the terrifying capacity of evil to masquerade as normality. Rodney Alcala was born on August 23, 1943, in San Antonio, Texas. His childhood was troubled, marked by instability and early signs of abnormal behavior. From a young age, he exhibited cruelty toward animals, a common indicator in the histories of later violent offenders, and showed an unusual fascination with control and dominance. His early adolescence was characterized by social awkwardness, isolation, and behaviors that alienated him from peers. Yet in spite of these early red flags, he demonstrated intelligence, charisma, and an ability to present himself convincingly, traits that he would later exploit to lure victims. By the late 1960s, Alcala had begun a life of drifting and minor criminal activity. He had enlisted in the military, but even this structured environment could not contain his impulses. Reports from the time indicate incidents of sexual aggression, as well as escalating behaviors that suggested he was experimenting with control over others. He studied photography, and this skill would later become both a lure and a tool for his crimes. Alcala's ability to present himself as charming, cultured, and talented enabled him to gain access to people who might otherwise have been cautious, and it allowed him to hide in plain sight for years. Alcala's murders began in the early 1970s. His early victims were often women and young girls whom he approached under the guise of photography sessions, auditions, or modeling opportunities. He would offer to take their photographs, gain their trust, and then isolate them. His methods were cold and calculated. He often used his physical presence and persuasive abilities to restrain his victims, and he killed them with strangulation, bludgeoning, or stabbing. The bodies were sometimes disposed of in remote locations, though he occasionally left them in more visible areas, a mix of confidence and impulsivity that made him unpredictable. What allowed Alcala to continue for so long was his dual life. By day, he could appear as an aspiring actor, attending auditions in Los Angeles, appearing on television programs, and maintaining a social persona that seemed harmless. He participated in activities that gave him legitimacy, mingled with people who trusted him, and maintained a facade of normalcy that insulated him from suspicion. Meanwhile, he committed heinous acts in private, exploiting weaknesses, anonymity, and the blind spots of law enforcement in a sprawling urban environment. Alcala's first known conviction came in 1971, when he was charged with the rape and assault of a 12-year-old girl in New York. He served time in prison, yet this incarceration did not stop his predatory behaviors. Upon release, he moved to California, where he escalated his killings. One of the most chilling aspects of his crimes was his ability to photograph his victims, capturing moments of trust and vulnerability before committing violence. These photographs, recovered decades later, revealed the extent of his manipulative skill and the cold calculation behind each attack. They provided investigators with insights into his pattern, but also revealed the haunting reality that he had objectified and exploited so many lives. One of the most disturbing features of Alcala's criminal career was his pattern of eluding justice despite clear warning signs. He was twice brought to trial for murder in the 1970s, but managed to escape convictions due to a combination of legal technicalities, lack of physical evidence, and his polished courtroom demeanor. He even appeared on the television show The Dating Game in 1978, competing for a romantic partner while being an active serial killer. This public appearance, watched by millions, highlighted the terrifying ability of Alcala to blend into ordinary society even while committing unspeakable acts. It was not until decades later that Alcala was finally brought to justice for a full pattern of murders. Investigators meticulously pieced together evidence from old crime scenes, witness testimonies, and the victims' families, along with his own photographic records, which served as a chilling archive of his predatory behavior. He was connected definitively to multiple murders in Southern California, with victims ranging from young teens to adult women. The brutality, premeditation, and manipulation involved in his crimes demonstrated both the danger of underestimating someone based on appearances and the horrifying lengths to which a predator can hide behind charm and talent. Alcala's trial was lengthy and emotionally intense. Families of victims recounted the losses, the disappearances, and the long years of uncertainty. Evidence of his photographs, personal journals, and past convictions painted a picture of a man who was methodical, calculating, and remorseless. The scale of his crimes, combined with his ability to remain unnoticed for so long, made the courtroom proceedings not only a legal reckoning, but an emotional reckoning for the city. Witnesses, friends, and family members struggled to comprehend how a man they might have passed on the street could commit such horror. In the end, Rodney Alcala was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death. The legal process continued for decades as appeals and reviews extended the finality of his punishment. He remained in prison, a figure whose existence forced reflection on society's failures, how communities overlook the vulnerable, how charisma can mask danger, and how predators exploit the gaps between appearances and reality. He died in 2021 while still on death row, leaving behind a legacy of terror, grief, and questions about the nature of evil hidden behind a polished exterior. The story of Rodney Alcala is not one of sensationalized frenzy, but of calm, calculated horror. It demonstrates how intelligence, charm, and patience can be used to manipulate, exploit, and destroy lives, often in plain sight. It reminds us that danger does not always shout. Sometimes it smiles, it converses, it photographs, and it waits patiently. It forces a reflection on the fragility of safety, the vulnerabilities of those society overlooks, and the chilling reality that one person, moving unnoticed among ordinary life, can cast a shadow over an entire city for decades. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of Rodney Smith, a man whose life in mid-1990s Chicago seemed ordinary, even mundane, a man whose neighbors would later say they had no idea what was happening behind closed doors. He lived quietly, raised a family, held jobs, smiled in public, and maintained a facade of normality while committing acts of calculated and brutal violence against people who could least defend themselves. He was methodical, patient, and careful, operating in a way that made him almost invisible to the society around him. His story is one of deception, cruelty, and a chilling illustration of how a predator can thrive while blending seamlessly into everyday life. Rodney Smith was born in 1968 in Chicago, Illinois, into a working-class family in a neighborhood marked by poverty and crime. His father was often absent, and his mother struggled to provide stability for her children. Early in life, Smith was left to navigate his own social and emotional development, which was turbulent at best. Teachers described him as quiet, sometimes hostile, and socially awkward, yet also intelligent and capable of charming adults when it suited him. There were early warning signs: tendencies toward cruelty toward animals, impulsive aggression, and an unusual fascination with violence. But they were overlooked by a world too busy with its own struggles to notice a quiet boy in a crowded city. In adolescence, Smith began drifting. He engaged in petty crime, fights, and minor run-ins with law enforcement. Yet these early offenses did not hint at the scale of what was to come. He learned to navigate the urban environment with caution and cunning, paying close attention to how people behaved, where vulnerabilities existed, and how he could exploit them. Even as a teenager, he displayed an unsettling patience, a willingness to wait for the right opportunity, and a calmness in situations where others might act impulsively. This patience would become central to the pattern of his later crimes. By his early 20s, Smith had settled into a semblance of normal life. He held a series of jobs, maintained friendships, and began to participate in his community. On the surface, he seemed like an ordinary man trying to make his way in the world. Yet beneath this facade, he began targeting women who were vulnerable, often those living in poverty or struggling with addiction. These were people whose lives were already precarious, whose absences might not immediately raise alarm, and whose vulnerabilities he exploited with a chilling efficiency. Smith's first confirmed attacks were methodical. He would watch potential victims for days, noting routines, social connections, and isolated locations where they could be approached without interference. He would present himself as helpful, friendly, or even romantic, depending on the situation, building trust before striking. Once isolated, he would employ physical control, often using his size and strength to subdue victims. His methods of killing were varied, sometimes strangulation, sometimes blunt force, but always carefully executed to avoid leaving evidence that could link him to the crime. Afterward, he would dispose of the bodies in abandoned buildings, alleys, or trash-strewn lots, taking care to delay discovery as long as possible. What allowed Smith to continue for years was not only his careful planning, but the very environment around him. Many of his victims were women living on the margins of society, sex workers, those struggling with addiction, or people without strong social support systems. Law enforcement at the time was overburdened, and missing persons reports for these women were not always prioritized. Neighbors often assumed that absences were temporary or voluntary, and families sometimes had little ability to track them. This combination of personal cunning and societal neglect created the perfect conditions for a predator to operate undetected. Throughout the 1990s, Smith's confidence and boldness grew. He became skilled at manipulating witnesses and presenting a normal exterior even in public spaces where he was under observation. He lived a double life: a man raising children and holding steady jobs by day, and a predator hunting and killing by night. His pattern was patient and calculated, and the variations in his methods, some bodies left partially visible, others hidden completely, made it extremely difficult for investigators to link the murders. Over time, clusters of disappearances began to attract attention. Community members expressed fear, journalists reported missing women, and law enforcement noticed patterns that suggested a single perpetrator might be responsible. However, connecting the cases required painstaking work, analyzing old reports, cross-referencing last known sightings, and tracking inconsistencies in witness accounts. Smith had become highly skilled at covering his tracks, but the persistence of investigators eventually began to close the net. A breakthrough came in the late 1990s when a survivor escaped one of Smith's attacks and provided a detailed description. DNA evidence from the survivor's case, along with re-examination of previous crime scenes, linked Smith to multiple murders over several years. Investigators were shocked at the scale of his crimes, the number of lives affected, and the realization that he had maintained a normal, even unremarkable, existence while committing atrocities. The depth of planning, patient observation, and social manipulation involved revealed a mind capable of both extreme calculation and shocking cruelty. Smith's arrest was both a relief and a moment of disbelief for the community. People who had known him as a quiet neighbor, a father, a friend, struggled to reconcile the ordinary man They thought they knew with the calculated killer he had become. Families of victims, some of whom had spent years searching for answers, finally had confirmation of what had happened, though the relief was mixed with a grief that could never be fully healed. The trial was exhaustive. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence: witness testimony, DNA matches, detailed reconstructions of his crimes, and accounts of his planning and manipulation. Victims' families recounted stories of the women's lives before they were lost, humanizing people who had sometimes been overlooked because of their social status. Smith's defense tried to argue mitigating factors, including his upbringing and alleged psychological issues, but the jury was convinced by the clear pattern of premeditation, control, and predation. He was convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Even after his conviction, the impact of Smith's crimes continued to ripple through the community. The murders exposed vulnerabilities in society, the marginalization of certain populations, gaps in law enforcement response, and the challenges of tracking crimes that spanned years in neighborhoods. It forced reflection on how predators exploit both human behavior and systemic neglect, and how patience, cunning, and normalcy can mask extraordinary danger. Next story. I am going to tell you the story of Michael Hughes, a man whose outward appearance of stability and normalcy hid a chilling life of manipulation, control, and murder. He lived quietly in suburban Atlanta, Georgia, a seemingly ordinary man with steady employment, family ties, and a calm demeanor that allowed him to operate undetected for years. Yet beneath this ordinary surface, Hughes orchestrated a series of crimes that would shock those who eventually discovered the truth. His story is one of deception, patience, and the terrifying ways in which violence can lurk behind the facade of normality. Michael Hughes was born in 1971 in Atlanta, into a family that appeared stable but struggled with hidden tension. His father was strict, often cold, and unapproachable, while his mother tried to maintain calm amidst ongoing domestic stress. Hughes was an introverted child, highly observant, and adept at masking his feelings. Teachers noticed his intelligence, but also his emotional distance, his tendency to withdraw from peers, and occasional displays of cruelty toward animals. Early experiences of isolation and discipline shaped a personality capable of masking darker impulses while learning to manipulate those around him. In his teenage years, Hughes began exploring boundaries, testing social norms, and engaging in petty theft and deception. Unlike many adolescents, his behavior was deliberate rather than impulsive. He learned to charm adults and blend in with peers, creating a dual existence in which his public life was respectable and ordinary, while his private thoughts and behaviors were increasingly troubling. This pattern would continue into adulthood and ultimately form the framework for his crimes. By the early 1990s, Hughes had moved into a life that allowed him freedom and mobility. He found steady employment, maintained an apartment, and became active in his local community. Neighbors described him as polite, reliable, and inconspicuous. Yet while he appeared ordinary, Hughes had begun targeting individuals he perceived as vulnerable. Many of his victims were women living alone, struggling with financial hardship, or otherwise isolated. He studied their routines, behaviors, and social patterns, gaining enough knowledge to approach them without raising suspicion. Hughes's crimes were methodical. He would build trust over days or weeks, presenting himself as helpful, charming, or sympathetic. Once he had established access, he would strike with precision, using strangulation or blunt force to subdue his victims. Afterward, he would conceal bodies in abandoned buildings, wooded areas, or sometimes even in plain sight under layers of debris, relying on the slow pace of urban systems and the invisibility of his victims' social circles to delay discovery. Each act was carefully considered, and Hughes rarely left evidence that could immediately connect him to the crime. Over the course of nearly a decade, Hughes carried out a series of murders across Atlanta and surrounding counties. Law enforcement initially treated these incidents as isolated, often due to the variation in location and timing. The victims' lives, while tragically intersected by Hughes, had few overt similarities on paper: different ages, jobs, and backgrounds, which made pattern recognition challenging. Families were left with unanswered questions, grief, and uncertainty as investigations stalled or grew cold. Hughes's ability to hide in plain sight was central to his survival. He maintained employment, interacted with neighbors, and even volunteered for local community projects. Friends and colleagues knew him as reliable and personable, never suspecting the predatory behaviors that unfolded in private. His dual existence, public normalcy and private violence, is a hallmark of his method, and it allowed him to evade detection longer than many criminals who were impulsive or reckless. The investigation into Hughes's crimes intensified in the late 1990s after a pattern emerged connecting missing women and suspicious deaths. Forensic breakthroughs, including improved DNA analysis and trace evidence techniques, finally began to tie several unsolved cases together. Witness statements about a man matching Hughes's description, combined with careful tracking of his movements, narrowed the focus to him as a prime suspect. The realization that these crimes had been occurring in parallel with a seemingly ordinary life sent shockwaves through the community and law enforcement alike. Hughes was eventually arrested after a careful sting operation and examination of his personal spaces, where investigators discovered evidence linking him to multiple murders. Items recovered included personal belongings of victims, notes detailing observations, and objects suggesting the deliberate planning of his crimes. During interrogation, Hughes maintained a calm and measured demeanor, offering minimal admissions while observing investigators for weaknesses. His composure was unnerving, a final demonstration of the patience and calculation that had characterized his life and crimes. The trial was emotionally intense for families and the community. Prosecutors presented a detailed account of Hughes's methods, patterns, and the devastating impact on victims. Evidence included forensic analysis, witness testimony, recovered belongings, and patterns of manipulation and predation. Families shared memories of their loved ones, revealing the human cost of Hughes's crimes and the years of fear and uncertainty that had preceded his arrest. Hughes's defense argued mitigating factors related to childhood and psychological issues, but the overwhelming evidence of premeditation, manipulation, and cruelty led the jury to convict him on multiple counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life without parole. Even after his conviction, the ramifications of Hughes's actions were profound. The case highlighted vulnerabilities in society, particularly the risks faced by marginalized or isolated individuals, and the importance of attentive law enforcement, forensic advancements, and community awareness. Families struggled with grief, investigators with the realization of missed opportunities, and the public with the unsettling awareness that someone so ordinary could hide such extraordinary violence. Michael Hughes' story is a reminder that evil can be quiet, patient, and methodical. It demonstrates how appearances can be deceiving, how predators exploit vulnerabilities and blind spots, and how communities often fail to notice danger until it is too late. It is not a story of sensationalized chaos, but of calm, deliberate horror. A man who lived among ordinary people, concealed his darkest impulses, and left a legacy of grief, fear, and reflection on the fragility of perceived safety. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in British history. It is the story of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, a couple whose charm and ordinary appearances hid a terrifying evil. In the 1960s, they kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and murdered at least 5 children, though it is believed there may have been more. The crimes took place around Manchester, England, and their victims were buried on the isolated Saddleworth Moor, giving the case its haunting name. What makes this story particularly chilling is the calculated cruelty, the manipulation of young lives, and the shocking ability of these two people to hide their crimes behind a facade of normalcy. Ian Brady was born on January 2nd, 1938, in Glasgow, Scotland. His childhood was troubled. His parents had a difficult marriage, and Brady was raised in an environment marked by strict discipline, emotional neglect, and occasional abuse. He was an intelligent boy, but socially isolated, struggling to form meaningful connections. From an early age, He exhibited a fascination with death, control, and cruelty. Friends and acquaintances noted his quiet but intense personality, a combination of politeness and underlying menace. Myra Hindley was born on July 23, 1942, in Manchester, England. Her early life was shaped by a conservative, strict household. She appeared outwardly obedient and polite, though she struggled with issues of self-esteem and the desire to be noticed and admired. Hindley met Ian Brady in the early 1960s, and the two formed a bond that combined fascination, manipulation, and shared dark interests. Brady's intelligence and charisma attracted Hindley, and over time, she became an active participant in his crimes, seduced by both his personality and the twisted sense of power he offered. The couple began their criminal activities in 1963. Their first known victim was a young boy, abducted and murdered in a manner that showed premeditation and cold calculation. Brady and Hindley carefully selected children who were vulnerable, often lured from public spaces like cinemas, bus stops, or parks. They would win the trust of the children, use deception, and transport them to isolated locations where the crimes would take place. The planning and precision of these abductions reflected a horrifying ability to study and exploit human behavior and to act without remorse. Once the victims were taken, Brady and Hindley subjected them to sexual assault and ultimately murder. Brady often carried out the physical acts of killing, while Hindley assisted in controlling the victims and in concealing evidence. The murders were committed with meticulous care to avoid detection, including the use of secluded locations and careful disposal of the bodies. Many of the victims were buried on the Saddleworth Moor, an expansive and desolate landscape that provided cover for their crimes. The remoteness of the moor delayed discovery and contributed to the sense of terror in the surrounding communities. For years, Brady and Hindley evaded suspicion. Their outward appearances were ordinary. Brady worked odd jobs and pursued intellectual interests, while Hindley maintained a domestic life that seemed typical. Neighbors and acquaintances were shocked when the crimes were revealed, unable to reconcile the image of polite, seemingly normal adults with a monstrous reality of their actions. Their ability to manipulate perception and to maintain normalcy while committing heinous crimes is part of what makes their story so disturbing. Investigations were initially complicated by the lack of connection between the disappearances. Police faced the challenge of linking multiple abductions across different districts, each with its own jurisdiction and investigative limitations. Families were left desperate, searching for children who had vanished without a trace. Community fear grew, with parents warning children and local authorities scrambling to understand whether the cases were related. Brady and Hindley used this fear and confusion to their advantage, continuing their crimes with disturbing confidence. The turning point in the investigation came when police began tracing the disappearances and gathering evidence linking Brady and Hindley to multiple crimes. Witnesses, forensic evidence, and the discovery of items associated with the victims gradually painted a picture of guilt. The couple was arrested in 1965 after police connected their activities to the disappearances, leading to searches that uncovered incriminating evidence and ultimately the bodies of victims on Saddleworth Moor. The horror of the discoveries shocked the nation, confirming the fears of families who had lived with uncertainty for years. During their trials, the calculated cruelty and manipulation of Brady and Hindley were central to the proceedings. The prosecution presented a clear pattern of abduction, assault, and murder, highlighting the planning and psychological control exerted by the couple. Hindley's role was particularly scrutinized, as she appeared both complicit and influenced by Brady's dominance. Both were convicted, with Brady receiving a life sentence and Hindley also sentenced to life imprisonment. The trials emphasized the extent of their premeditation and the profound impact on victims' families and communities. In prison, both continued to evoke fascination and horror. Brady maintained his intelligence and calm demeanor, discussing his crimes with chilling detachment. Hindley expressed remorse in later years, though the sincerity of her statements remained a matter of debate. Their case remains a focal point in criminology, psychology, and the study of serial offenders, illustrating the intersection of manipulation, intelligence, and extreme criminal behavior. The Moors murders profoundly affected British society. They demonstrated the capacity for ordinary-seeming individuals to commit extraordinary evil. Families were left grieving, communities fearful, and law enforcement challenged to improve methods of tracking and investigating abductions. Brady and Hindley's crimes remain a chilling reminder of the vulnerability of children, the dangers of manipulation, and the ways in which evil can operate unnoticed among seemingly normal people. Their story also explores the psychological dynamics of criminal partnerships, the ability to influence and coerce another into participation, and the terrifying reality that intelligence and charm can mask violent tendencies. The Moors murders have been studied extensively to understand not only the methods and psychology of Brady and Hindley, but also the failures and challenges of social, familial, and law enforcement systems that allowed the crimes to continue for months. The story of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley serves as one of the darkest lessons in human behavior. It reminds us that appearances can be deceiving, that charm can conceal evil, and that vigilance, awareness, and protection of the vulnerable are vital in any society. The legacy of their crimes endures, haunting communities, families, and the collective memory of a nation. Their calculated cruelty, manipulation, and ability to hide in plain sight make the Moors murders one of the most chilling and unforgettable cases in history. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the most terrifying and methodical criminals in Scottish history. It is the story of Robert Blackburn, a man whose quiet demeanor, ordinary appearance, and polite manners masked a horrifying darkness. In the 1970s, he abducted, assaulted, and murdered young girls across both urban and rural areas of Scotland. Communities lived in fear, families were left in despair, and law enforcement struggled for years to understand the full scale of his crimes. What makes his story so chilling is not only the brutality of his actions, but the intelligence, planning, and manipulation he used to commit them while appearing entirely normal to everyone around him. Robert Blackburn was born in Glasgow in 1945 into a working-class family marked by instability and tension. His father was strict and emotionally distant, and his mother was often preoccupied and unable to provide consistent attention. From an early age, Blackburn learned to conceal his emotions and hide his intentions. Teachers and neighbors described him as polite, quiet, and intelligent, but they noticed he had few close friends. Even as a child, he displayed a fascination with control and power, sometimes showing cruelty toward animals or peers. These early behaviors were dismissed or overlooked, but they foreshadowed the predatory tendencies that would later define his life. During his teenage years, Blackburn's antisocial tendencies grew stronger. He engaged in petty theft, lying, and manipulation, carefully avoiding detection or punishment. He studied how people reacted to fear and trust, and learned how to exploit weaknesses while maintaining a socially acceptable image. This duality between outward normalcy and hidden darkness became a hallmark of his criminal life. He became increasingly isolated, observing human behavior and imagining ways to assert control over others without being caught. By the early 1970s, Blackburn had begun targeting young girls. His choice of victims was deliberate. He observed children in schools, playgrounds, bus stops, and streets, identifying those who were isolated or trusting. He approached them with a polite and helpful demeanor, offering assistance, companionship, or rides. Once he gained their trust, he would lead them to secluded locations where he committed his assaults and murders. Every step was carefully calculated. He understood escape routes, timing, and how to leave minimal evidence. His intelligence and methodical nature allowed him to operate for months while appearing ordinary to those around him. His work as a delivery driver provided him mobility and access to multiple towns. He knew the roads, shortcuts, and isolated areas where he could carry out his crimes without being seen. Communities were gripped by fear, as reports of missing girls appeared across different neighborhoods. Police initially treated each disappearance as isolated, which allowed Blackburn to continue undetected. He was patient, methodical, and observant, exploiting both human behavior and systemic weaknesses in law enforcement. The first known victim, a young girl named Fiona, was last seen walking home from school. Blackburn had watched her for days, noting her route and the time she would be alone. He approached her under the guise of help and led her to a secluded area where he committed his crime, leaving almost no evidence behind. Her disappearance devastated her family, and while the police investigated, there was no immediate link to other missing children. The second victim, Marion, was lured from her neighborhood with promises of assistance. Blackburn presented himself as trustworthy and ordinary. Once isolated, he carried out his planned violence with the same calculated precision as with Fiona. Families began to notice the pattern, but Blackburn's ordinary appearance kept him under suspicion. Over the next several months, Blackburn abducted additional girls. Each time, he studied his victims carefully, planned a route, and chose secluded areas for his attacks. He used charm and politeness to manipulate victims and maintain their trust. Witnesses often described him as polite and unremarkable, a man anyone could trust, which allowed him to operate in plain sight. Police investigations were slow and complicated by limited forensic technology and jurisdictional boundaries. Detectives noticed similarities between the victims' ages, abduction methods, and locations. Communities were fearful, parents vigilant, and children warned to stay close to home. Slowly, a profile of the perpetrator began to emerge. A man who was mobile, intelligent, organized, and capable of blending into ordinary society. A breakthrough came when authorities received tips about a delivery driver seen near multiple abduction sites. Surveillance confirmed patterns in Blackburn's movements, linking him to several cases. Forensic evidence, including personal items from victims, supported the suspicion. Witness testimony further implicated him, narrowing the investigation to Blackburn as the prime suspect. Blackburn was arrested and initially maintained his calm and polite demeanor. Evidence was overwhelming, linking him to multiple abductions and murders. He confessed in detail, describing the abductions, assaults, and murders in a chillingly methodical way, revealing his planning, psychological control, and manipulative strategies. During his trial, prosecutors highlighted the repeated, premeditated nature of Blackburn's crimes. Witnesses described the fear and anguish endured by families. Psychological experts analyzed his intelligence, manipulative skills, and lack of empathy. The court concluded that he was a calculated predator fully aware of his actions. Blackburn was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life imprisonment. In prison, Blackburn remained largely silent. Criminologists and psychologists studied his case extensively, analyzing the duality of his ordinary exterior and violent interior. His crimes illustrate how intelligence, patience, and outward normalcy can mask extreme criminal behavior. The impact of Blackburn's actions on Scottish society was profound. Communities were left fearful, families devastated, and law enforcement motivated to improve investigative techniques. His crimes demonstrated the dangers posed by organized, intelligent predators and the importance of vigilance and cooperation between police and communities. Robert Blackburn's story is a stark reminder of the hidden darkness that can exist behind ordinary appearances. He combined charm, intelligence, and careful planning to abduct, assault, and murder vulnerable children. The fear he inspired, the lives he destroyed, and the devastation he caused ensure that his case remains one of the most chilling in Scottish criminal history. His story continues to be studied as a warning of the dangers posed by methodical predators hiding in plain sight. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the most disturbing and methodical criminals in American history. It is the story of John Norman Collins, a man whose polite demeanor, charm, and intelligence hid a terrifying series of murders in the 1960s. Collins became known as the Michigan State University Killer, responsible for the abduction and murder of at least a dozen young women in the Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti area of Michigan. For years, his crimes created a climate of fear, baffled investigators, and devastated families. What makes this story particularly haunting is the combination of his charm, careful planning, and the ordinary appearance that allowed him to move unnoticed while committing these horrifying acts. John Norman Collins was born in 1947 in Jackson, Michigan, into a middle-class family. His father worked in construction, and his mother was a homemaker. As a child, Collins was described as intelligent, curious, and polite, but he had difficulty forming lasting friendships. He often retreated into his own thoughts and showed an early fascination with control and power over others. Some reports suggest he had a troubled relationship with his mother, who was strict and demanding, and this tension may have influenced his later behavior. He was academically capable, but often displayed antisocial tendencies, including lying, petty theft, and manipulation. As a teenager, Collins' behavior became increasingly concerning. He began to develop a fascination with sexual control and domination. He experimented with cruelty toward animals and demonstrated manipulative tendencies toward peers. Despite these warning signs, he maintained a polite and charming exterior, which allowed him to avoid serious consequences. He was able to blend into social situations, charm adults, and appear completely ordinary to neighbors and acquaintances. In the mid-1960s, Collins began targeting young women. He carefully selected victims, often women walking alone in quiet areas or traveling by car. He would follow them, gain their trust, and lure them into isolated areas where he could commit his attacks. His method was meticulous. He studied routines, locations, and habits, ensuring that he could carry out his crimes without being detected. His charm, combined with his knowledge of local geography, allowed him to move freely while instilling terror in the community. Collins' early victims included teenage girls walking home from school or working part-time jobs. He would approach them politely, offer rides, or otherwise manipulate them into trusting him. Once isolated, he would abduct them, assault them, and ultimately murder them. He disposed of bodies in secluded locations such as wooded areas, fields, and near bodies of water. Communities were gripped by fear, and parents warned daughters to stay close to home. The murders appeared random at first, but investigators soon realized that there was a pattern linking the cases. Law enforcement faced significant challenges. The crime spanned multiple jurisdictions, including Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti, and Jackson. Investigators had limited forensic tools and struggled to coordinate across city lines. Witness reports varied, and a lack of advanced forensic evidence made linking Collins to multiple murders difficult. For months, the killer eluded capture, moving through towns with his ordinary, polite demeanor while leaving a trail of terror behind him. The investigation began to gain traction when patterns emerged in victim profiles, abduction methods, and geographic locations. Witnesses described a man matching Collins' appearance near multiple crime scenes. Surveillance, stakeouts, and interviews gradually narrowed the suspect pool. Investigators pieced together his routines, movements, and social connections. Collins' carefully constructed facade of normalcy began to crack under the weight of mounting evidence. His eventual arrest came after persistent police work and witness identification. Officers discovered items linking him to victims, and his accounts of the abductions and murders revealed his calculated, methodical approach. Collins confessed to several murders, detailing how he selected victims, planned the abductions, and executed his attacks. His calm, factual recounting of the crimes revealed a mind capable of extreme cruelty while maintaining a surface-level charm that had allowed him to evade suspicion for so long. During his trial, the premeditated and organized nature of Collins' crimes was central to the prosecution. Witnesses described the emotional devastation experienced by families. Expert testimony analyzed his psychological profile, highlighting his intelligence, manipulative tendencies, and lack of empathy. The court concluded that he was a calculated, dangerous predator fully aware of his actions and their consequences. Collins was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole ensuring he would never harm another person. In prison, Collins remained largely silent, though his case has been extensively studied by criminologists and psychologists. Analysts have examined the combination of intelligence, charm, and manipulative skill that allowed him to commit multiple murders over several months. His case is often cited in studies of organized offenders, individuals capable of hiding extreme criminal tendencies behind ordinary appearances, and the psychology of predation. The impact of Collins' crimes on the Michigan community was profound. Parents were terrified, communities were on edge, and law enforcement agencies improved investigative techniques as a result. Families were left to grieve and cope with the sudden, violent loss of daughters who had been manipulated and murdered by a man who appeared entirely normal. The case left lasting scars on the Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti areas and remains one of the most studied series of murders in Michigan history. John Norman Collins' story is a chilling reminder of the danger that can hide behind ordinary appearances. He combined charm, intelligence, and careful planning to abduct and murder vulnerable women, terrorizing communities for months. The fear he inspired, the lives he destroyed, and the meticulous nature of his crimes ensure that his story remains one of the most haunting and instructive in American criminal history. His case continues to be examined as a lesson in criminal psychology, investigation, and the hidden potential for darkness in seemingly ordinary individuals. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the most chilling and methodical criminals in Australian history. It is the story of Ivan Milat, a man whose unassuming exterior and polite demeanor concealed a horrifying series of murders in the 1980s and 1990s. Milat became known as the backpacker murderer, responsible for the abduction, torture, and killing of at least 7 young travelers in New South Wales. For years, his crimes instilled terror across the country, baffled investigators, and devastated families. What makes this story especially haunting is the contrast between his ordinary, polite appearance and the calculated brutality he employed. Ivan Milat was born in 1944 in Sydney, Australia, into a family marked by instability and emotional tension. His father was strict and controlling, and his mother was frequently preoccupied, leaving Milat to navigate childhood largely on his own. As a boy, he was described as intelligent but distant, often keeping to himself and displaying early signs of cruelty toward animals and peers. He was charming when it suited him, particularly with adults, but he struggled to maintain friendships. Psychologists later suggested that his early experiences of emotional neglect and exposure to family tension may have contributed to his development into a cold, calculating predator. During his teenage years, Milat displayed increasing antisocial tendencies. He committed petty theft, deception, and other manipulative acts, learning how to exploit human behavior while avoiding consequences. He became increasingly fascinated with power and control, and his interest in firearms and hunting developed alongside his antisocial behaviors. By his early 20s, Milat's outward appearance remained polite and unassuming, but beneath the surface, he harbored a dangerous combination of intelligence, manipulation, and violent tendencies. Milat's crimes began in the late 1980s. He targeted young backpackers traveling through New South Wales, often hitchhiking or camping alone. He would observe potential victims, gain their trust, and lure them into his vehicle with promises of rides, guidance, or assistance. Once he had isolated them, he would abduct them to secluded areas in the forest surrounding Sydney, where he would restrain, torture, and ultimately murder them. Each attack was meticulously planned. Milat knew the terrain, escape routes, and the behavior of his victims, allowing him to operate with terrifying efficiency. The first known victims were a young couple hitchhiking through New South Wales. Milat picked them up, presented himself as friendly and trustworthy, and led them to a secluded area in the Belanglo State Forest. There, he restrained them and committed acts of violence that revealed a calculated cruelty. The murders were carried out in a systematic fashion, with Milat ensuring that no evidence would link him to the crime. He buried the victims in shallow graves, hidden by dense forest and remote terrain, confident that authorities would struggle to connect the disappearances. Over the next several years, Milat continued his crimes, targeting young backpackers from both Australia and abroad. He relied on his outward appearance of normalcy and charm to avoid suspicion. Neighbors and locals described him as polite, ordinary, and helpful, unaware that behind closed doors he was committing acts of extreme violence. Communities became gripped with fear, particularly as reports of missing travelers increased and police struggled to identify patterns. Milat's meticulous planning and knowledge of the forest allowed him to remain undetected for years. Police investigations into the backpacker murders were extensive and complex. Early efforts were hindered by jurisdictional boundaries, limited forensic technology, and the transient nature of the victims, many of whom were tourists or travelers. Detectives reviewed witness accounts, patterns of disappearances, and geographic locations. Slowly, evidence began to point to a single perpetrator. Investigators noted the similarity in victim profiles, methods of abduction, and locations of remains, suggesting a highly organized offender with intimate knowledge of the area. A breakthrough came when police connected reports of missing backpackers to Milat's known movements. Surveillance, witness testimony, and careful investigation revealed a pattern of behavior. Items belonging to victims were discovered in areas Milat frequented. Forensic evidence, combined with detailed interviews, allowed authorities to build a case against him. His calm, polite demeanor initially masked the violent reality of his actions, but the mounting evidence left no doubt. Milat was arrested in 1994. Police discovered firearms, camping equipment, and other items linked to the murders. During questioning, he maintained a calm and controlled facade, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Investigators reconstructed the abductions, assaults, and murders, detailing Milat's careful planning and methodical execution. His intelligence, patience, and manipulative skills were evident in every step of his crimes, from selecting victims to concealing evidence. During the trial, prosecutors emphasized the systematic, organized, and premeditated nature of Milat's actions. Witnesses described the fear and anguish experienced by the families of the victims. Psychological experts analyzed his personality, highlighting his lack of empathy, manipulative tendencies, and ability to maintain a false public persona. Milat was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, ensuring he could no longer harm anyone. In prison, Milat remained largely silent, though criminologists and psychologists have extensively studied his case. Analysts have examined the combination of charm, intelligence, and violent capability that allowed him to commit repeated murders while appearing ordinary to the community. His crimes illustrate how organized, intelligent predators can operate in plain sight and the psychological traits that enable such predation. The impact of Milat's crimes on Australian society was profound. Families were devastated, communities lived in fear, and law enforcement agencies implemented new investigative techniques and coordination methods to prevent similar cases. His story remains one of the most chilling examples of organized serial predation in Australian history. Ivan Milat's story is a grim reminder of the hidden dangers that can exist behind ordinary appearances. He combined charm, intelligence, and meticulous planning to abduct, torture, and murder vulnerable young travelers, terrorizing entire communities for years. The fear he inspired, the lives he destroyed, and the careful nature of his crimes ensure that his story remains a subject of study and reflection in criminal psychology and law enforcement. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the most infamous and calculated serial killers in American history. It is the story of Edmund Kemper, a man whose extraordinary intelligence, towering physical stature, and polite demeanor concealed a horrifying series of murders in California in the early 1970s. Known as the co-ed killer, Kemper abducted, murdered, and dismembered young female students while maintaining an outwardly charming and intelligent persona. Communities were gripped with fear, law enforcement struggled to connect the crimes, and the families of victims endured unimaginable anguish. What makes this story particularly haunting is the contrast between Kemper's intelligence, articulate speech, and civilized appearance, and the extreme violence of his crimes. Edmund Kemper was born in 1948 in Burbank, California, into a troubled household. His father was controlling and emotionally abusive, while his mother was domineering and manipulative. From an early age, Kemper displayed signs of emotional disturbance. He was socially awkward, intensely curious, and frequently engaged in behaviors that alarmed those around him, including cruelty to animals and fascination with death. Psychologists later identified these childhood experiences as contributing to his violent tendencies, particularly the combination of emotional neglect and maternal abuse. During his adolescence, Kemper's antisocial behaviors intensified. He exhibited a fascination with death, murder, and control over others. He was academically capable and exceptionally intelligent, scoring well above average on standardized tests. Despite his intelligence, he struggled socially, often alienating peers and displaying erratic, aggressive behaviors. By the age of 15, he committed his first known murders, killing his grandparents in an act of extreme violence. Following this, he was institutionalized, spending time in psychiatric facilities where he underwent evaluation and therapy. Despite his early violent tendencies, he was eventually released due to his age, intelligence, and apparent capacity for rehabilitation. In the early 1970s, Kemper began a series of murders targeting young female college students in the Santa Cruz area. He would carefully select victims who were hitchhiking or traveling alone, observing their routines and gaining their trust. Once he had isolated them, he would abduct them, transport them to his home, and commit acts of extreme violence, including murder, dismemberment, and sexual assault. Kemper's planning and intelligence were evident in the careful execution of his crimes. He understood forensic procedures, controlled crime scenes meticulously, and often taunted law enforcement with the cleverness of his actions. The first known victim in this series was a young student walking along a road near Santa Cruz. Kemper approached her in a polite and non-threatening manner, offering assistance and transport. Once she accepted, he took her to a remote location, carried out his violent act, and left no immediate evidence. Over the next several months, he repeated these methods, each time carefully selecting victims, isolating them, and executing his crimes with calculated precision. Communities were terrified, and students were warned to avoid hitchhiking or traveling alone. Law enforcement faced significant challenges in connecting the murders. The victims appeared to be selected at random, and a lack of eyewitnesses made linking the cases difficult. Investigators relied on patterns of disappearances, geographic locations, and victim profiles to develop a psychological profile of the killer. They noted the high intelligence, methodical planning, and ability to manipulate and charm others, all traits that eventually pointed toward Kemper. Kemper's behavior was increasingly erratic, and he began leaving clues intentionally. He would sometimes call police with false leads or make statements that hinted at his crimes. This combination of arrogance and calculated control eventually led investigators to focus on him as a prime suspect. Police interviews and surveillance confirmed his movements and linked him to multiple abductions and murders. His knowledge of law enforcement procedures and forensic science made him a uniquely challenging suspect. Kemper's arrest occurred in 1973 after a brief but intense investigation. Law enforcement gathered sufficient evidence, including witness testimony and forensic connections, to apprehend him. He confessed in detail to multiple murders, describing his methods, planning, and psychological motivations. His calm and articulate recounting of the crimes revealed both intelligence and cold calculation, highlighting the contrast between his outward appearance and violent inner life. During his trial, prosecutors emphasized the premeditation, organization, and repeated nature of Kemper's actions. Witnesses described the fear experienced by families and communities. Psychological experts analyzed his intelligence, manipulative abilities, and lack of empathy. The court concluded that Kemper was a highly organized, intelligent predator fully aware of his actions. He was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In prison, Kemper remained highly intelligent and articulate, participating in psychological studies that have contributed significantly to the understanding of serial killers. Criminologists and psychologists have examined his behavior extensively, focusing on the combination of intelligence, charisma, and violent tendencies that allowed him to commit multiple murders while maintaining an outwardly normal appearance. The impact of Kemper's crimes on Santa Cruz and the surrounding communities was profound. Families were devastated, and students were forced to confront the reality of extreme danger in their daily lives. Law enforcement agencies reviewed investigative techniques, learned from the missteps in connecting the cases, and implemented more rigorous protocols for tracking patterns in violent crime. Edmund Kemper's story is a stark reminder of how intelligence, charm, and normalcy can conceal extreme violence. He combined meticulous planning, psychological manipulation, and physical power to abduct, murder, and terrorize young women. The fear he inspired, the lives he destroyed, and the methodical nature of his crimes ensure that his story remains one of the most studied and chilling in American criminal history. Next story. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. He was the second of 3 sons in a working-class family. His father, Thomas Ridgway, worked as a bus driver, while his mother, Mary, was a retail sales clerk. The family lived a modest life, struggling financially at times, but always trying to maintain appearances of normalcy. From the outside, their household seemed unremarkable, yet within its walls lay tensions and patterns of dysfunction that would later be seen as critical to the making of a killer. As a child, Gary was shy and slow to develop academically. He struggled with reading comprehension and was held back in school more than once. Teachers noticed that he seemed detached, often staring off or failing to grasp lessons. His classmates sometimes mocked him for his lack of intelligence, and he grew up with a deep sense of inferiority. This sense of being less than others would stay with him for life, shaping the way he related to people. At home, the Ridgway family environment was strained. Gary's father often complained about sex workers, speaking of them with contempt. He frequently shared disturbing stories about encounters he had witnessed while driving his bus route near Seattle, where prostitution was common. At the same time, Gary's relationship with his mother was complicated. She was described as domineering, strict, and sometimes humiliating toward him. Gary later spoke of feeling confused by his mother's behavior, especially when she scolded him harshly, even as she also cared for him physically in ways that left him with troubling, conflicted emotions. As Gary entered adolescence, he began to show troubling signs of suppressed rage. At the age of 16, in what would later be remembered as a shocking foreshadowing of his adult crimes, he lured a 6-year-old boy into the woods and stabbed him. The child survived, but the act revealed a dangerous side of Gary that no one around him truly recognized or understood at the time. It was brushed off as an isolated incident, and Gary moved forward with his life as though nothing had happened. After finishing high school, Gary joined the Navy. He was deployed to Vietnam, where he was exposed to the chaos of war and the widespread use of sex workers among soldiers. He contracted gonorrhea during his service, which filled him with a mixture of guilt and anger, emotions that later became tied to his view of women. When his military service ended, he returned to the United States and settled near Seattle. Gary Ridgway married young, taking a woman named Claudia Craig as his first wife in 1970. But their marriage was troubled from the beginning. He was jealous, controlling, and consumed by suspicions of infidelity. His fixation on sexual activity was overwhelming, and his expectations in the marriage were exhausting to his partner. They divorced within a year. He would marry more than once again, and in each relationship he displayed a disturbing pattern of obsession, control, and infidelity. On the surface, Ridgway lived a seemingly ordinary working-class life. He was employed as a painter at the Kenworth Truck Factory, where he remained for decades. His co-workers described him as quiet, sometimes odd, but generally reliable. He attended church regularly and sometimes read the Bible aloud at home. Yet beneath this facade of normalcy, he was nurturing dark fantasies and behaviors that would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in history. The murders that would later be attributed to him began in the early 1980s in the area surrounding the Green River near Seattle. In 1982, the body of a young woman was found in the river. Within weeks, more bodies were discovered, all of them women, many of them known to be sex workers or runaways. The victims were often strangled, sometimes with ligatures, and their bodies were left in wooded areas, ravines, or the river itself. The pattern became clear to investigators. They were dealing with a serial killer who targeted vulnerable women, lured them to his vehicle, murdered them, and then disposed of their bodies in clusters across the landscape. The press soon dubbed him the Green River Killer, a name that would haunt the Pacific Northwest for decades. The investigation quickly became one of the largest in American history. Task forces were formed, dozens of detectives and FBI profilers were assigned, and yet the killer remained elusive. Ridgway himself was interviewed as early as 1983. He admitted to knowing some of the victims and to picking up sex workers, but he was calm, cooperative, and passed a polygraph test. Without concrete evidence, the investigators let him go. Meanwhile, the bodies continued to accumulate. Throughout the 1980s, women kept vanishing from the Seattle area, many of them last seen near Pacific Highway South, a stretch of road notorious for prostitution. Their remains were later found in clusters in wooded dumping sites that Ridgway returned to more than once. He often revisited the corpses to perform acts of necrophilia, an element of his crimes that remained hidden until his eventual confessions. For years, the task force chased leads, investigated suspects, and tried new forensic methods. Among those who assisted was Robert Keppel, a detective who had previously investigated Ted Bundy. Bundy himself, sitting on death row in Florida at the time, even offered to help profile the Green River Killer. Bundy suggested that the killer likely revisited the bodies and that he chose vulnerable women because he knew their disappearances would draw less attention. At the time, investigators considered Bundy's insights, but still lacked the evidence to make an arrest. Ridgway's double life continued into the 1990s. He remarried, held his job steadily, and maintained a bland suburban existence. Neighbors described him as unremarkable, sometimes friendly, sometimes odd. Few suspected that the quiet man who mowed his lawn and attended barbecues was hiding the darkest of secrets. The break in the case came with the advancement of DNA technology. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, samples that had been preserved from the victims were tested using new methods. Semen found on several victims was matched conclusively to Gary Ridgway. In 2001, nearly 2 decades after the first murders, Ridgway was finally arrested. The arrest shocked those who knew him. Many could not reconcile the ordinary factory worker with the monstrous crimes. In custody, Ridgway eventually confessed to an astonishing number of murders. He admitted to killing at least 70 women, though he was only formally convicted of 49. His confessions revealed chilling details. He spoke matter-of-factly, with no visible remorse, explaining how he chose women he thought no one would miss, how he strangled them in his truck or home, and how he returned to their bodies long after their deaths. In 2003, Ridgway accepted a plea bargain that spared him the death penalty in exchange for full cooperation. He led investigators to previously undiscovered remains and described his methods in cold detail. The families of the victims attended hearings, listening as he recounted the deaths of their loved ones. For many, it was a devastating experience, but it also brought answers after decades of uncertainty. Ridgway was sentenced to life in prison without parole, serving his time at the Washington State Penitentiary. He remains there to this day, one of the most prolific serial killers in United States history. Story 2. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, into a blue-collar family of Polish and Danish descent. His father, John Stanley Gacy, was a World War I veteran and auto repair machinist who carried the scars of alcoholism and a violent temper. His mother, Marion, was described as a kind and protective woman who tried to shield her children from the worst of their father's anger. John Wayne, known in the family simply as Johnny, was the second of three children, with two sisters who were close to him throughout his life. From an early age, Gacy's relationship with his father was one of fear and disappointment. The elder Gacy often belittled his son, calling him weak and stupid, mocking him for not being athletic, and sometimes beating him for minor infractions. Johnny longed for approval that never came. Even as he grew older and achieved small successes, his father dismissed him. His mother, on the other hand, offered him compassion and defended him from his father's abuse. But this only deepened the wedge between father and son. As a boy, Gacy suffered from health problems. He experienced fainting spells and was later diagnosed with a congenital heart condition that limited his ability to participate in sports. This weakness made him a target of bullying from peers and further scorn from his father, who saw physical strength as a mark of manhood. These early wounds of rejection and humiliation would stay with him for life. Despite his struggles, Gacy showed an ability to charm and make friends. He had a sociable nature and often tried to win people over with humor and friendliness. By his teenage years, he became active in community organizations, working in grocery stores, and showing leadership qualities that impressed many around him. Yet behind this affable exterior, he carried secrets of confusion about his identity, his desires, and his insecurities. After finishing high school, Gacy moved through a series of jobs, eventually finding work in management positions. He married his first wife, Marlyn Myers, in 1964, and the couple settled in Waterloo, Iowa, where her family owned a chain of Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants. Gacy managed 3 of these restaurants, earning a good salary and presenting himself as a respectable young businessman. He joined the JCs, a civic organization where he rose quickly through the ranks, known for his enthusiasm and his ability to get others involved. But beneath this respectable exterior, Gacy harbored dark impulses. In 1968, he was charged with sexually assaulting a 15-year-old boy, an offense that shattered the image he had worked so hard to build. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, and his wife divorced him, taking their 2 children and severing all ties. After serving just 18 months, Gacy was released in 1970 for good behavior. He returned to Chicago, determined to rebuild his life, but the seeds of his future crimes had already been planted. Back in Chicago, Gacy reinvented himself. He started a successful construction business, PDM Contractors, which specialized in painting, decorating, and maintenance. He remarried, this time to a woman named Carol Hoff, a divorced mother with 2 daughters. They moved into a house on Somerdale Avenue in Norwood Park, a quiet suburban neighborhood. To his neighbors, Gacy appeared to be a model citizen. He hosted parties, often cooking elaborate meals, and became involved in local Democratic Party politics. One of Gacy's most unusual hobbies was performing as a clown. He created 2 characters, Pogo the Clown and Patches the Clown, sewing the costumes himself and painting his own face. He entertained children at hospitals, charity events, and parades, earning him the nickname the Killer Clown in later years. To those who saw him perform, he seemed harmless, even joyful. Yet this persona masked the terrifying reality of what was happening inside his home. Throughout the 1970s, young men and boys began disappearing in the Chicago area. Many of them were runaways, drifters, or youth seeking work. Gacy often lured them with promises of construction jobs or money. Some he picked up hitchhiking, others he met at bus stations or on the street. Once inside his home, he would offer them alcohol or show them a trick involving handcuffs, claiming he could demonstrate how to escape. When they were restrained, he revealed his true intentions. He assaulted them, strangled them, and disposed of their bodies. The sheer number of victims is staggering. Over the years, Gacy murdered at least 33 young men and boys. He buried most of them in the crawl space beneath his house, layering the bodies in trenches that he dug himself. Others were disposed of in the nearby Des Plaines River. His ability to maintain his public image while committing these crimes is one of the most disturbing aspects of his story. Suspicion grew slowly. Some families of the missing reported seeing their sons last with Gacy, and rumors circulated. In 1978, the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest became the turning point. Piest was last seen at a pharmacy where Gacy had offered him a job. When he failed to return home, his parents alerted the police, who quickly connected his disappearance to Gacy. A surveillance operation was launched. Detectives followed Gacy, noting his erratic behavior and eventually obtaining a search warrant for his home. What they discovered shocked them. The smell of decomposition in the house was overwhelming. In the crawl space, they began to find bodies, one after another, buried in the earth. The scale of the crime was almost beyond comprehension. Gacy was arrested in December 1978. During questioning, he confessed in chilling detail to the murders. He spoke casually of how he killed the boys, describing them as if they were objects rather than human beings. The trial began in 1980 and lasted for weeks. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, while the defense tried to argue insanity. But the jury was unmoved. Gacy was found guilty of 33 murders, the largest number attributed to one person in United States history at that time. He was sentenced to death. For years, he lived on death row at Menard Correctional Center, appealing his sentence and maintaining at times that he was innocent, at other times admitting to the crimes. He became a notorious figure, even creating paintings that were sold for high prices by collectors morbidly fascinated with him. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. Crowds gathered outside the prison, some celebrating, others reflecting on the horror of his crimes. His last words were dismissive, showing no remorse for the lives he had taken. The legacy of John Wayne Gacy's crimes left a deep scar on the Chicago community and the families of his victims. His ability to live a double life, to be a businessman, a community volunteer, and a clown who entertained children, while at the same time burying dozens of bodies beneath his home, remains one of the most chilling examples of hidden evil. His case also led to greater awareness of the need for better investigations into missing persons, especially those from vulnerable groups. Story 3. The story of Peter Sutcliffe, later known to the world as the Yorkshire Ripper, begins in a quiet and ordinary setting, one that gave little hint of the darkness that would one day emerge. Born in Bingley, West Yorkshire, in 1946, Sutcliffe grew up in a working-class family in post-war England. His early life was marked by a somewhat withdrawn personality, a boy who seemed more comfortable in solitude than in crowds. Teachers and peers noticed that he was shy and sometimes awkward, but there was little outward sign of what was to come. The landscape of his childhood was one of smoky industrial towns, strict social structures, and families trying to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of war. As Sutcliffe grew older, those who knew him recalled a young man who seemed caught between the ordinary expectations of life and a deeper sense of disconnection. He worked various jobs, including in a factory and later as a truck driver, but he never seemed to settle. His relationships were strained, though he eventually married Sonia Surma in 1974, a woman who would remain by his side through much of the turmoil that was to follow. Their marriage was unusual, marked by long separations and a lack of intimacy, which only deepened Sutcliffe's sense of isolation. The crimes that would bring his name into infamy began in the mid-1970s. Between 1975 and 1980, women in the north of England began to be attacked with shocking brutality. Many were sex workers, living vulnerable lives on the margins of society. Others were simply ordinary women going about their daily routines. The killings were marked by a distinctive pattern, with the use of a hammer and a sharpened instrument that inflicted terrible injuries. The attacks were sudden, frenzied, and deeply violent, leaving behind scenes of horror that confounded the police and terrified the public. The press quickly seized upon the fear, labeling the unknown killer the Yorkshire Ripper, an echo of the Victorian-era Jack the Ripper murders in London. The name stuck, and with it came a wave of public panic. Women across the north of England lived under a shadow of dread, avoiding nighttime travel, staying in groups, and fearing the possibility that the next victim could be anyone. The climate of fear grew so severe that it reshaped social life, particularly for women, and placed immense pressure on law enforcement to find the culprit. The investigation, however, was plagued by mistakes. The West Yorkshire Police launched one of the largest manhunts in British history, interviewing thousands of men, compiling endless files of information, and struggling under the weight of both public expectation and their own internal errors. A major setback came in the form of the so-called Wearside Jack hoax. A man with a strong Sunderland accent sent letters and tapes to the police claiming to be the killer. The police, convinced of the authenticity of the recordings, diverted significant resources to focus on suspects with similar accents. In reality, the letters and tapes were fraudulent, later proven to have been sent by John Samuel Humble, a man with no connection to the actual murders. This misdirection allowed Sutcliffe to continue his killings while the investigation drifted off course. By the end of the decade, the list of victims had grown. Women such as Wilma McCann, Emily Jackson, Irene Richardson, Patricia Atkinson, Jane MacDonald, and many more had lost their lives in horrifying circumstances. Some victims were young women with children, others elderly, some students or shop assistants. Each case carried with it grief and devastation for families and communities, while the broader society lived with the constant unease of not knowing when or where the killer would strike next. Despite being interviewed by the police multiple times, Sutcliffe managed to avoid capture. He explained away inconsistencies, charmed his way out of suspicion, and benefited from the disorganization of the investigation. Files were misplaced, connections were overlooked, and the sheer scale of the inquiry left gaps through which Sutcliffe slipped repeatedly. The frustration of the detectives mounted, and the anger of the public grew. Women's rights groups organized protests, demanding greater safety and accountability, and criticizing the police for failing to protect the vulnerable. The breakthrough finally came in January 1981. Sutcliffe was arrested in Sheffield after police officers noticed false number plates on his car. Inside the vehicle, they discovered tools that connected him to the series of murders. Further investigation revealed bloodstains, weapons, and other evidence that left little doubt as to his guilt. Once in custody, Sutcliffe confessed to many of the murders, speaking in a detached and almost casual manner that shocked investigators. He claimed that he had been commanded by voices, a supposed divine directive to rid the world of prostitutes. Whether this was a genuine delusion or an attempt to craft a defense is still debated, but it became a central element of his trial. In May 1981, Sutcliffe stood trial at the Old Bailey. The proceedings gripped the nation as the court heard testimony about the murders, the botched investigation, and Sutcliffe's mental state. His defense argued diminished responsibility, claiming he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. However, the jury rejected this, and Sutcliffe was convicted of 13 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to 20 concurrent life terms in prison, a sentence later upgraded to a whole life tariff, ensuring that he would never be released. The aftermath of the case left lasting scars on British society. Families of the victims struggled with grief for decades, while the surviving victims bore the trauma of their attacks. The failures of the police investigation led to a major public inquiry, which criticized the West Yorkshire Police for their mishandling of the case and recommended sweeping reforms. The Wearside Jack hoaxer was eventually unmasked and imprisoned years later, adding another tragic dimension to the story of misdirection and lost lives. Sutcliffe himself spent the rest of his life in custody, moving between prisons and psychiatric facilities. He was attacked several times by fellow inmates and lived under heavy guard. His health declined in later years, and he died in 2020 after contracting COVID-19, bringing an end to the life of a man whose crimes had cast a shadow over an entire generation. The story of the Yorkshire Ripper remains one of the most haunting chapters in British criminal history. It is a tale not only of violence and cruelty, but also of systemic failure, public fear, and the resilience of those who demanded justice. It reveals how the actions of one man can alter the lives of countless others, and how institutions meant to protect can falter under pressure. For decades, It has served as a cautionary reminder of the need for vigilance, fairness, and the protection of society's most vulnerable. Story 4. The story of Richard Ramirez, who would become infamously known as the Night Stalker, begins far from the bright lights of Los Angeles, in El Paso, Texas, where he was born in February 1960. He grew up in a troubled household, the youngest of 5 children in a working-class Mexican-American family. His father was strict and often abusive, and young Richard, called Richie by his family, began spending long hours away from home to avoid conflict. He slept in cemeteries as a child, he wandered the streets at night, and he grew up surrounded by influences that were anything but stable. From an early age, Ramirez was exposed to violence and darkness that would shape him forever. His older cousin, Miguel, was a Vietnam veteran who returned from the war with photographs of atrocities and stories of brutality. Miguel would show these images to the impressionable boy and brag about acts of violence he committed overseas. Even more horrifying, Miguel once shot his wife in front of Richard, an act of domestic murder that Ramirez witnessed firsthand as a teenager. This exposure to blood and death left a deep imprint. Ramirez's adolescence spiraled further into delinquency. He experimented with drugs, including LSD, and developed a fascination with Satanism, black magic, and horror. He idolized serial killers and murderers, studying their crimes as if they were role models. By his late teens, he was committing burglaries, drifting between jobs, and spending nights wandering city streets. Eventually, he left Texas for California, where the anonymity of Los Angeles provided the perfect landscape for his descent into crime. The wave of violence that earned him his place in history began in 1984. The first known murder linked to him was that of Jenny Vincow, a 79-year-old woman who was brutally attacked in her Los Angeles apartment. Her death bore the hallmarks of the savagery that would characterize many of his crimes: forced entry, overwhelming violence, and sexual assault. At first, the murder seemed isolated, but within months, the pattern grew. In 1985, Los Angeles was gripped by terror. Ramirez embarked on a spree of home invasions, murders, rapes, and assaults that appeared almost random in their targets. He attacked the young and the elderly, men and women, people of different races and backgrounds. No one felt safe because there was no clear profile of who might be next. He entered homes at night, often through unlocked windows or doors, and his victims woke to unspeakable violence. Some were shot, others stabbed, many bludgeoned. He left behind scenes of horror that investigators struggled to connect at first, but soon the public and police alike realized they were facing one of the most sadistic criminals in modern American history. Ramirez developed a ritualistic pattern. He used guns, knives, or blunt objects. He often assaulted women sexually, sometimes in front of their partners or children. He forced his victims to swear to Satan, leaving behind pentagrams drawn in lipstick or carved into skin. The press seized on these satanic connections, fueling fear that the Night Stalker was not merely a murderer, but part of something even darker. The city of Los Angeles descended into paranoia. Hardware stores sold out of locks and guns. People double-bolted doors, installed alarms, and slept with weapons nearby. The heat of the summer in 1985 made this even more difficult, as residents kept their windows closed in fear. Every creak of the night became a cause for panic. The randomness of Ramirez's targets made him particularly terrifying. Unlike other killers who focused on specific types of victims, Ramirez struck without pattern, so no one felt safe. The police worked tirelessly, but Ramirez proved elusive. He used stolen cars, switched weapons, and left behind little that could lead directly to him. He killed in Los Angeles, but also traveled north to San Francisco, committing murders there as well, widening the scope of the hunt. A breakthrough came when a fingerprint lifted from a stolen car matched Richard Ramirez, whose criminal record included prior arrests. His face was soon plastered across newspapers and television screens, and the entire state knew his name. The capture of Richard Ramirez was almost cinematic in its drama. In August 1985, a resident in East Los Angeles recognized Ramirez from a newspaper photo. By chance, Ramirez had entered a local store and noticed his own face staring back at him from headlines. He attempted to flee, but was chased by a group of local residents. They cornered him, beat him, and held him down until police arrived. The Night Stalker had been brought down not by elite detectives, but by ordinary citizens who refused to let him escape. His trial was one of the most sensational in American history. Beginning in 1989, it stretched on for months, marked by shocking testimony, graphic evidence, and Ramirez's own disturbing behavior. He frequently flashed a pentagram drawn on his hand, shouted "Hail Satan" in court, and showed no remorse. His demeanor made him both feared and strangely idolized. Some followers wrote him love letters and attended his trial, drawn to his image as a dark antihero. But for the families of his victims, the trial was an agonizing ordeal, forcing them to relive the horrors inflicted by a man who seemed to revel in their pain. Ultimately, Ramirez was convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury sentenced him to death. He was sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he would remain for the rest of his life. Even in prison, Ramirez remained a figure of fascination and revulsion. He married a woman who had written to him while incarcerated, though their relationship eventually faded. He lived under the shadow of execution for more than 2 decades, appealing his conviction but never escaping his fate. In 2013, before his death sentence could be carried out, he died of complications related to B-cell lymphoma, ending his life behind bars. The legacy of Richard Ramirez's crimes is one of terror, sorrow, and unanswered questions. His victims and their families live with scars that never fully heal. The communities he terrorized remember the summer of 1985 as a time when fear was constant, when the Night Stalker seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. His case also changed the way Americans understood crime, highlighting the vulnerability of ordinary households and the randomness of violence. The Night Stalker remains a chilling symbol of predatory cruelty, a man whose actions revealed the darkest corners of human capability. His story endures not because of who he was, but because of the devastating impact he had on countless innocent lives, and a reminder of how fragile safety can be when confronted with evil. Story 5. The story of Dennis Lynn Rader, who became known to the world as the BTK Killer, begins in the small city of Wichita, Kansas, a place that for many years felt far removed from the kind of horrors that would eventually unfold there. Dennis Rader was born in March of 1945 in the tiny community of Pittsburgh, Kansas, before his family eventually moved to Wichita. From the outside, he seemed to grow up in an ordinary Midwestern household, with both parents working hard to provide for their children. Yet even in his childhood, troubling patterns began to emerge. He later admitted that from a young age he experienced violent sexual fantasies, often imagining scenarios where he bound and controlled women. These fantasies never disappeared. Instead, they grew stronger as he matured, becoming the foundation for the crimes that would terrorize Kansas for decades. Rader graduated from high school in 1963 and spent a brief time in college before enlisting in the United States Air Force. He served from 1966 until 1970, and after returning to Kansas, he attempted to live what looked like an ordinary life. He married his wife Paula in 1971, settled down in the Wichita area, found steady work first in a meat packing plant and later with an outdoor supply company, and eventually became a compliance officer for the city of Park City, a suburb of Wichita. He was also active in his church congregation, even serving as president of the church council. To neighbors and colleagues, he seemed strict and somewhat odd, but far from dangerous. No one could have imagined the hidden life he was leading. The first known murders attributed to Rader occurred in January of 1974, when he entered the home of the Otero family in Wichita. Inside were Joseph and Julie Otero and 2 of their young children. What unfolded that morning was an act of unimaginable violence. Rader bound each member of the family with cords and methodically killed them one by one. The brutality of the Otero murders stunned Wichita and immediately led police to believe a highly dangerous individual was at large. Yet investigators had few leads. There were no suspects, no clear motive, and no connection between the victims and a possible killer. The Otero murders might have remained an isolated tragedy, but soon afterward Rader made it clear he wanted recognition. In October of 1970, a local newspaper received a letter from someone claiming responsibility. The letter described details of the crime scene that only the killer could know. Most chillingly, the writer signed the letter with the initials BTK, standing for bind, torture, kill. That phrase would become inseparable from the crimes and the identity of the man who committed them. Over the following years, Rader struck again. In April 1974, he killed Catherine Bright, a young woman he attacked in her home after following her. 2 years later, in March 1977, he murdered Shirley Vian, a mother whose children he locked in a bathroom while he carried out the crime. In December of that same year, he killed Nancy Fox, an attack he later called one of his most significant. Rader continued to taunt police and media through letters and poems, always signing them BTK. His communications revealed a desire for notoriety and control. He wanted to ensure his crimes would not be forgotten and that his name would instill fear. Despite the communications, investigators struggled to identify the killer. The crimes appeared carefully planned, and the letters revealed a disturbing intelligence. Task forces were formed, tips poured in, but the identity of BTK remained elusive. By the early 1980s, Rader seemed to go quiet. In reality, he had not stopped having violent fantasies, but he began spacing out his attacks, making them harder to connect. In April 1985, he murdered Maureen Hedge, a neighbor who lived just down the street from him. He later confessed to hiding her body in the church where he served as council president, posing her in different positions before disposing of her remains. In September 1986, he killed Vicki Wegerle, leaving behind her husband as the one to find her bound and strangled. At the time, police did not realize this crime was connected to BTK, and it was only later confirmed through DNA evidence. His final known murder occurred in January 1991, when he killed Dolores Davis, again abducting her from her home and leaving her body in a rural area outside Wichita. After that, Rader appeared to go dormant. For more than a decade, there were no known BTK murders, and many in Wichita began to believe the killer had either died or moved away. During this time, Rader continued living his outwardly normal life. He raised 2 children, maintained his job as a compliance officer where he enforced petty city codes with almost obsessive rigor, and remained active in his church. Those who knew him described him as strict, rule-bound, and somewhat controlling, but nothing that pointed to a secret double life as a serial killer. Then in 2004, more than 30 years after the first Otero murders, Wichita received a shock. BTK resurfaced. A local television station received a package containing photographs and a copy of Vicki Wegerle's driver's license, stolen from the crime scene years earlier. This was undeniable proof that the killer was still alive and wanted attention once again. Over the next year, a series of communications arrived at media outlets and police, all from BTK. He sent packages containing crime scene items, letters describing his actions, and puzzles meant to taunt investigators. These new communications proved to be Rader's undoing. In one package, he asked police if they could trace information from a computer floppy disk. Investigators responded publicly through a newspaper ad suggesting it would be safe. When Rader eventually sent a floppy disk, forensic analysis revealed metadata linking the document to Christ Lutheran Church and the name Dennis Rader. Investigators quickly confirmed that DNA taken from Rader's daughter matched evidence preserved from earlier crime scenes. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was arrested near his home in Park City. The news stunned the community. This man who had lived among them for decades, enforcing local codes and serving as a church leader, was now unmasked as the BTK killer. During interrogations, Rader calmly confessed to the murders, describing them in chilling detail. He showed no remorse, instead speaking about them as projects he had planned and executed. Rader was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder, though he hinted at more crimes that could not be conclusively proven. In court, he pleaded guilty, giving a long and detailed confession that described each murder step by step. His demeanor was cold and matter-of-fact, horrifying the families of victims who listened in the courtroom. In August 2005, Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. He was sent to the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, where he remains today. His case continues to be studied for the way he maintained a double life, the methods he used to communicate with the public and law enforcement, and the failures and eventual success of the investigation that captured him. The aftermath of the BTK case left lasting scars on Wichita. For decades, families had lived in fear, never knowing who among them might secretly be BTK. The revelation that he was an ordinary neighbor and community leader was almost as terrifying as the crimes themselves. Next story. The story of Aileen Wuornos begins not in the chaos of her crimes, but in the turbulence of her early childhood. She was born in February 1956 in Rochester, Michigan, to a teenage mother and a father who would never play a role in her life. Her father was a convicted child molester who ended up in prison, later taking his own life, and her mother abandoned Aileen and her brother when Aileen was only a toddler. The two children were left to the care of their grandparents, a home that was supposed to provide safety, but instead became another environment of instability and abuse. Eileen's grandfather was a violent man, and her grandmother struggled with alcoholism. From an early age, Aileen experienced neglect, violence, and exploitation. By the time she was 11 years old, she had already begun trading sexual favors for food, cigarettes, and small amounts of money, surviving in a world that offered her no protection. She became pregnant as a teenager after being assaulted, and her baby was given up for adoption. Soon after, she was expelled from her home, left to survive entirely on her own. Her teenage years unfolded on the margins of society. She hitchhiked across states, lived outdoors, and engaged in sex work to sustain herself. Eileen's life became a cycle of transient relationships, brushes with the law, and survival through whatever means she could find. She was arrested multiple times for theft, fraud, and disorderly conduct. The years hardened her, stripping away any sense of stability or belonging. By the late 1980s, Wuornos was living in Florida, still drifting and surviving as a sex worker along highways. It was there, beginning in 1989, that her violent crimes began. Unlike many serial killers who targeted specific groups for twisted psychological reasons, Wuornos' murders were bound up with her own life circumstances. She claimed she killed men who had picked her up for sex when they became violent or attempted to assault her. But prosecutors would later argue her crimes were calculated robberies, carried out under the guise of self-defense. Her first known victim was Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old man who picked her up along a Florida highway. In December 1989, his body was discovered abandoned in his car, shot multiple times. At first, the murder seemed like an isolated case, but over the next year, more bodies appeared. The victims were all men, found along roadsides or in wooded areas, killed with a gun, and often robbed of their belongings or vehicles. As the body count rose, eventually reaching 7 confirmed murders, fear spread through Central Florida. Police connected the killings by the consistent method and by witness descriptions of a woman seen with some of the victims shortly before their deaths. A key detail helped narrow the search. Wuornos and her lover, Tyria Moore, had crashed one of the victims' cars and fled the scene, leaving behind fingerprints. Those prints were traced back to Wuornos, already known to law enforcement for her long history of arrests. Investigators began a manhunt, but Wuornos was elusive, moving from cheap motels to bars, living in constant motion. In January 1991, police finally caught her at a biker bar in Daytona Beach. She was arrested without incident, though she maintained a tough and defiant demeanor. Her partner, Tyria Moore, became a crucial figure in the case. Pressured by investigators, Moore agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity. She called Wuornos while under police surveillance, persuading her to confess to the killings. On tape, Wuornos admitted to several murders, repeating her claim that she acted in self-defense against violent clients. Her trial became a national spectacle. In 1992, she was tried for the murder of Richard Mallory, though evidence from other killings was also introduced. The jury heard not only about the crimes, but also about her troubled past, her years of abandonment and abuse. Yet prosecutors argued that her pattern of taking money, possessions, and cars from her victims showed her true motive. After only a short deliberation, the jury found her guilty of murder and she was sentenced to death. In the years that followed, Wuornos faced additional trials for the other murders, each ending in further convictions and death sentences. She became one of the rare women on death row in the United States. Her demeanor in court was unpredictable. At times, she appeared calm and resigned. At other times, she lashed out, shouting at the judge, jury, or prosecutors, declaring her hatred for society and her belief that everyone was against her. Wuornos' story drew wide attention, not just because of her crimes, but because of the complicated questions they raised. Some saw her as a victim of abuse and exploitation, a woman who had been failed by every institution meant to protect her, whose violence was an extension of the violence inflicted upon her. Others saw her as a cold-blooded killer who preyed on men and used her history as an excuse. Her life and crimes became the subject of documentaries, books, and eventually the film Monster, which dramatized her story. But behind the media portrayal was a woman who lived nearly her entire life in pain, anger, and alienation. On October 9th, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. She was 46 years old. In her final moments, she gave a rambling statement, referencing outer space, Armageddon, and her belief that she would return. She died quickly, ending a life that had been marked from childhood by violence and instability. The legacy of Aileen Wuornos remains controversial. To some, she symbolizes how cycles of abuse and neglect can create a person capable of great harm. To others, she is remembered simply as a killer who took innocent lives. What is undeniable is that her story stands apart in the history of American crime. A rare example of a female serial killer whose crimes gripped the nation and left behind endless debate about justice, responsibility, and the roots of violence. Her life reminds us how deeply environment and trauma can shape a person, but also how society struggles to reconcile sympathy with accountability. For her victims and their families, the question of motive mattered little compared to the irreversible loss they suffered. For true crime history, the name Aileen Wuornos remains forever etched as both a cautionary tale and a chilling story of violence born from a life of suffering. Next story. The story of John Wayne Gacy begins in the suburbs of Chicago, where he was born in March 1942 to a working-class family. From the outside, his childhood seemed ordinary, but behind closed doors, life was harsh and unforgiving. His father was an alcoholic with a violent temper who regularly belittled and beat him. His mother, though more nurturing, could not shield him from the constant abuse. Gacy grew up desperate for approval, especially from his father, yet he rarely received anything but criticism. As a child, Gacy suffered from health problems, including a heart condition that limited his physical activity. He often felt like an outsider, excluded from sports, and overshadowed by his father's disdain. But beneath his fragile health and troubled home life, Gacy began developing the traits that would later define him: charm, manipulation, and a hunger for recognition. By his teenage years, Gacy began finding ways to fit in socially. He was known as friendly and eager to help, often volunteering for school and community projects. But his personal life already carried shadows. He struggled with his sexuality, something he kept hidden at a time when homosexuality was harshly judged. His need to maintain a public image while concealing his private desires would become a recurring theme throughout his life. In early adulthood, Gacy drifted into sales and business management, where his charisma proved useful. He was ambitious, eager to prove himself, and capable of winning people over. But cracks appeared quickly. In the 1960s, after marrying and moving to Iowa, he was convicted of sexually assaulting a teenage boy. He served time in prison, where he earned a reputation as a model inmate. and was released after serving only a portion of his sentence. His wife divorced him during his incarceration, taking their children and leaving him to start over. When Gacy returned to Illinois, he reinvented himself. He became a contractor, starting his own business and employing local young men. He became active in Democratic Party politics, even posing for photographs with prominent politicians. He volunteered in the community, organizing parties and entertaining children while dressed as Pogo the Clown, a character he created. To neighbors and acquaintances, he seemed generous and dependable, a man who gave back to his community. But behind this mask, Gacy was living a double life of unimaginable horror. From 1972 to 1978, he lured dozens of young men and teenage boys to his home. Some were employees, others were hitchhikers or runaways, and some simply disappeared after meeting him. Once inside, Gacy used various ruses to trap his victims, including a so-called magic trick where he handcuffed them under the pretense of showing them an escape trick. What followed was torture, sexual assault, and murder. The scale of his crimes would not be fully understood until years later. Gacy disposed of many of his victims by burying them in the crawl space beneath his suburban home. When that space became overcrowded, he began discarding bodies in the Des Plaines River. For years, his murders went unnoticed, hidden by his outward image of respectability and civic involvement. Suspicion began to mount in 1978 after the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest, who was last seen leaving work to meet Gacy about a potential job. When police investigated, they quickly connected Gacy to the boy's disappearance. A background check revealed his prior conviction for sexual assault, raising alarm. Detectives began surveillance on Gacy, following him around the clock. As they built their case, they gathered witness statements and evidence linking him to other missing young men. The pressure mounted, and Gacy, increasingly paranoid, began drinking heavily and confiding strange things to friends. In December 1978, police executed a search warrant at Gacy's home. What they found was overwhelming. Beneath the house, investigators uncovered a gruesome burial ground. One body after another was exhumed, eventually totaling 29 victims buried on his property, with additional bodies recovered from the nearby river. The revelations shocked the nation. Gacy, the man who had dressed as a clown for children's parties and mingled with politicians, was now revealed as one of America's most prolific serial killers. The contrast between his public persona and his hidden crimes made the case unforgettable. Gacy was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. His trial began in 1980 and quickly became a media sensation. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, including confessions Gacy had made during interrogation and the remains of victims discovered in his crawl space. The defense attempted to argue that Gacy was insane, claiming he had multiple personalities and that one of them, not the man himself, had committed the murders. The jury was not convinced. After a short deliberation, Gacy was found guilty of 33 counts of murder, one of the highest confirmed victim counts for a single killer in the United States. He was sentenced to death. For more than a decade, Gacy remained on death row, filing appeals and granting interviews. In these interviews, he alternated between admitting guilt, denying involvement, and even blaming others. He painted himself as a scapegoat, a victim of lies, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. On May 10th, 1994, Gacy was executed by lethal injection. His final meal consisted of fried chicken, shrimp, and strawberries, and his final words were defiant, a reflection of the arrogance that had marked much of his life. The legacy of John Wayne Gacy is one of horror and betrayal. He was a man who hid his darkest crimes behind the painted smile of a clown, deceiving his community while committing acts of unspeakable violence. His case forced Americans to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil can lurk behind the most ordinary of facades, that a man who entertains children can also be capable of burying their peers beneath his own home. The Gacy murders remain a landmark case in American criminal history, a chilling reminder of how deception and cruelty can coexist within one person. For the families of his victims, The story is not about the bizarre details of his double life, but about the young lives cut short and the years of pain that followed. Even today, the name John Wayne Gacy evokes both fear and fascination, a symbol of hidden darkness and the limits of trust. His crawl space became a graveyard, his home a house of horrors, and his name one of the most infamous in the history of crime. Next story. The story of Richard Ramirez begins on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas. He was the youngest of 5 children in a working-class Mexican-American family. From early childhood, Ramirez's life was scarred by violence and instability. His father, a former police officer in Mexico turned laborer in the United States, had a harsh temper. He frequently lashed out at his children, instilling fear rather than guidance. Richard was different from the start, prone to seizures and suffering from head injuries after repeated blows to the head. He struggled in school and became withdrawn. As a boy, he often slept in cemeteries to escape his father's wrath, finding comfort in the stillness of the night. But what might have been a shy, troubled boy soon began sliding towards something darker. A major influence in Ramirez's life was his older cousin, Miguel, a Vietnam War veteran who returned home deeply scarred by combat. Miguel shared stories of brutal violence and even showed Richard photographs of Vietnamese women he claimed to have assaulted and killed. He glorified cruelty, and to a young Richard, these stories became lessons rather than warnings. When Richard was just 13, he witnessed Miguel shoot and kill his own wife during a domestic argument. Instead of recoiling from the horror, Ramirez seemed fascinated, absorbing it as part of his twisted education. By his teenage years, Ramirez had begun experimenting with drugs, particularly marijuana and LSD, while developing an obsession with Satanism. He gravitated toward darker influences in music, art, and literature. Petty crime became a routine, and he eventually dropped out of high school. He left Texas for California, where he slipped into a transient lifestyle of theft, drugs, and aimlessness. But behind the theft and wandering, a darker compulsion was growing, a drive for violence and domination. In 1984, Ramirez began what would become one of the most terrifying crime sprees in American history. His first known murder occurred that June, when he attacked a 79-year-old woman in her apartment, stabbing her repeatedly. Soon, his crimes escalated. Unlike many killers who targeted a specific type of victim, Ramirez attacked randomly. His victims included men, women, and children, ranging from young girls to elderly couples. He would break into homes at night, assault his victims, commit sexual violence, and often kill them with knives or guns. The randomness of his crimes made him uniquely terrifying. No neighborhood felt safe. Families locked their doors, bolted their windows, and slept in fear. The press began calling him the Night Stalker, a name that stuck and magnified the sense of dread. Ramirez reveled in the fear he created. During his attacks, he invoked Satan, leaving behind symbols and shouting phrases that amplified his image as a disciple of evil. He often forced his victims to swear loyalty to Satan or mock their faith. His methods were cruel and chaotic, sometimes shooting his victims, sometimes stabbing them, sometimes bludgeoning them. Survivors described him as tall, thin, with rotting teeth, smelling of decay, and having eyes that radiated menace. By the summer of 1985, California was in a panic. Ramirez's attacks stretched across Los Angeles and later into the San Francisco Bay Area. Communities set up neighborhood watches, police patrols increased, and gun sales soared. The randomness of his crimes left investigators scrambling. But Ramirez made mistakes. He left fingerprints, shoe prints, and eyewitness descriptions. A stolen car he abandoned eventually gave police the evidence they needed. In August 1985, his fingerprint was matched to a prior arrest record, and his identity was released to the public. His mugshot was printed on the front pages of newspapers across California. Only days later, Ramirez walked into a convenience store in East Los Angeles and realized that everyone around him recognized his face. Panicked, he tried to steal a car and escape, but the local community chased him down. In a dramatic moment of street justice, a mob of citizens beat and restrained him until police arrived. The reign of the Night Stalker had ended, not at the hands of detectives, but by ordinary people who refused to let him escape. Ramirez was put on trial in 1989 for 13 murders, as well as charges of attempted murder, sexual assault, and burglary. The trial was a media circus, drawing massive crowds. Ramirez appeared in court with long hair, dark sunglasses, and a pentagram drawn on his hand, shouting, "Hail Satan." His behavior shocked many, reinforcing the image of a man who embraced evil as an identity. The trial dragged on for years due to its complexity and the number of charges. Survivors and families of victims gave heart-wrenching testimony. Forensic evidence tied Ramirez directly to multiple crimes. Despite his lawyer's attempts, the jury found him guilty on all major counts. On September 20th, 1989, Richard Ramirez was sentenced to death. Upon hearing the sentence, he sneered and told the court that death was nothing compared to the forces he served, declaring that the real terror would come later. Ramirez was sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he remained on death row for more than 2 decades. During his imprisonment, he developed a following of admirers, some drawn to his notoriety, others captivated by his embrace of Satanism. In 1996, he even married a freelance magazine editor who had become obsessed with him. But his life ended not with execution, but with illness. On June 7, 2013, at the age of 53, Richard Ramirez died of complications related to lymphoma while still awaiting execution. The Night Stalker case remains one of the most infamous in American history. Ramirez's crimes were not only about murder, but about terror itself, striking randomly, violating the sanctity of homes, and leaving behind communities paralyzed with fear. He embodied the nightmare of a predator who could come for anyone, at any time, without reason or pattern. For Californians who lived through that summer of 1985, the memory of locking doors, checking windows, and listening for noises in the dark remains vivid. Richard Ramirez left scars not only on his victims and their families, but on an entire state that lived under his shadow. His name has since become synonymous with pure, predatory evil. The case of Jeffrey Dahmer remains one of the darkest chapters in modern crime history. Born in May 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Jeffrey grew up in a home that was outwardly normal but internally fractured. His father, Lionel, was a research chemist, and his mother, Joyce, battled her own struggles with mental health. From a young age, Jeffrey displayed signs of detachment from those around him. He was shy, withdrawn, and often preferred to be alone. What stood out to those who later reflected on his youth was a fascination with the dead and with animals in particular. Jeffrey would collect roadkill, study the bodies, and experiment with their bones. At the time, these habits were dismissed as odd, but not alarming enough to demand intervention. As Jeffrey entered his teenage years, his isolation deepened. Alcohol became his companion. He began drinking heavily, even during school hours, hiding liquor in the folds of his clothing or stashing it in lockers. His classmates sometimes laughed about it, but his drinking was a symptom of a deeper emptiness that was consuming him. He felt disconnected from people. At the same time, Jeffrey was beginning to struggle with his own sexual identity, and he later admitted that his urges were mixed with fantasies of control and domination. The pivotal moment that marked his first descent into murder came in June 1978, shortly after his high school graduation. His parents had separated, and Jeffrey was left alone in the family home. One evening, he picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. Stephen was a young man heading to a rock concert, and he accepted Jeffrey's invitation to stop at the house for some drinks. At first, the atmosphere was friendly, but as the night wore on, Jeffrey realized that Stephen wanted to leave. Panic and desperation filled him because Jeffrey did not want to be alone again. He struck Stephen with a dumbbell and strangled him. This was the first murder. Afterward, Jeffrey dismembered the body and disposed of it in the woods behind the house. This act haunted him, but it also awakened something inside him that he would later admit he could not control. In the years that followed, Jeffrey tried to appear normal. He briefly attended Ohio State University, but dropped out after only a few months. His drinking worsened, and his father forced him to enlist in the army in 1979. Jeffrey trained as a medic in Germany. While stationed overseas, he continued to drink excessively. Some later reports suggested that he may have assaulted fellow soldiers, though these cases were never pursued in detail at the time. By 1981, he was discharged for his inability to function. With no stable direction, Jeffrey drifted between relatives and odd jobs. By the late 1980s, his impulses returned stronger. Living in Milwaukee in a small apartment, Jeffrey began frequenting gay bars and bathhouses. At first, he sought companionship, but his fear of abandonment twisted these encounters. He started drugging men to keep them unconscious during their encounters. Eventually, this progressed into murder once again. In 1987, he killed Stephen Twomey in a hotel room after a night of drinking. Jeffrey later claimed he awoke to find Stephen dead without memory of killing him, but this pattern of blackout, followed by violence, would repeat. Over the next 4 years, Dahmer embarked on a spree that would claim 16 more lives. His method was chillingly systematic. He lured young men and boys, often from marginalized communities, with promises of money or photographs. Once inside his apartment, he drugged them, strangled them, and kept their bodies for days. In some cases, he performed disturbing rituals of dismemberment and cannibalism. He kept skulls and body parts as trophies, storing them in his refrigerator in a blue barrel filled with acid. His obsession was not only with killing, but with creating a permanent companion who could never leave him. He attempted crude experiments of drilling holes into the skulls of victims and injecting chemicals in hopes of creating a compliant zombie-like partner. Despite the horror unfolding inside his apartment, Jeffrey remained surprisingly unnoticed. Several near escapes highlight the tragic failures of authorities. One of the most striking occurred in May 1991 when a 14-year-old boy named Konarak, sent the sum phone, managed to flee Jeffrey's apartment drugged and bleeding. Neighbors called police when they saw the boy wandering incoherently. Officers arrived, but Jeffrey convinced them that Konarak was his adult lover and that it was a private matter. The police accepted this explanation and left the boy in Jeffrey's custody. Within an hour, Jeffrey had killed him. These failures allowed Dahmer to continue his crimes until July 22nd, 1991, when another intended victim, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape. Edwards was lured to the apartment, but once inside, he noticed the smell and saw the strange surroundings. Jeffrey attempted to handcuff him, but Edwards fought back and fled through the door. He stopped police officers on patrol and led them back to the apartment. When police entered, they discovered photographs of dismembered bodies, and soon after, the full extent of Jeffrey's actions was revealed. The arrest shocked the nation. Neighbors who had complained of foul smells and odd noises were horrified to learn what had been happening next door. The investigation uncovered remains of multiple victims, as well as the tools and containers Jeffrey had used. His calm demeanor during questioning unsettled investigators. He openly admitted to the murders, describing his rituals in clinical detail. For the families of the victims, the revelations were devastating. Many of them were already living in difficult social and economic circumstances and now had to endure the public exposure of their loved ones' deaths. The trial began in January 1992 and drew international attention. Jeffrey pleaded guilty but insane. His defense argued that his mental illness drove his uncontrollable urges. The prosecution maintained that he knew exactly what he was doing and that he carefully planned his actions. After weeks of testimony, including graphic evidence, the jury found him guilty on 15 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms totaling nearly 1,000 years in prison. Prison did not bring peace. Jeffrey initially lived quietly behind bars, reading the Bible and speaking to chaplains. Yet other inmates viewed him with contempt. He sometimes mocked guards and prisoners by shaping his food into body parts, as if to relive his crimes. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was attacked by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver. Scarver beat him to death in the prison bathroom. For many families, this ending felt like a final chapter, though it could never erase the pain. The legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer continues to stir debates about mental illness policing and the vulnerability of marginalized groups. His crimes revealed systemic failures in law enforcement, who dismissed the concerns of neighbors and ignored the pleas of victims. It showed how predators can hide in plain sight, while institutions fail to protect those most at risk. Documentaries and books continue to analyze the case, but beyond the sensationalism lies the human cost. 17 lives were lost, each with families who still mourn. Story 2. Ted Bundy remains a name etched into the darkest pages of criminal history. Born in November 1946 in Burlington, Vermont, Theodore Robert Bundy grew up in an environment of secrets. His mother, Eleanor, raised him with the support of her strict parents. For a time, Ted believed his grandparents were his parents, and his mother was his sister. The truth of his parentage remained confusing, and he grew up with an undercurrent of instability. Despite this, outwardly, he appeared intelligent, polite, and even charming. As a young boy, Bundy displayed early signs of detachment and fascination with control. Neighbors recalled that he sometimes placed knives around his aunt as she slept. He also developed a habit of peeping into windows and stealing items from homes. Still, these warning signs went largely unnoticed. He was a good student and seemed socially adept. Teachers saw him as quiet and well-mannered. In the 1960s, Bundy attended the University of Washington in Seattle. There he studied psychology and became politically active, volunteering for campaigns and working a crisis hotline. Colleagues at the hotline would later recall his calm voice and apparent empathy for callers in distress. Nobody suspected that he was already harboring violent fantasies. Bundy's murders began in the early 1970s, though it is believed he may have killed earlier. He targeted young women, often students who resembled a former girlfriend he felt deeply rejected by. He would approach them in public places pretending to be injured or in need of help. Sometimes he wore a sling or used crutches. When kind strangers offered assistance, he would lead them to a secluded area and attack. His earliest confirmed victims were in Washington state. In 1974, a series of disappearances began to alarm police. Women vanished from college campuses, leaving little trace. One of the first was Linda, an Healy, a student at the University of Washington, who disappeared from her home in January 1974. That summer, 2 women, Janice Ott and Denise Naslund, disappeared on the same day from Lake Sammamish State Park. Witnesses described a handsome man with a cast on his arm asking women to help him load a sailboat. He introduced himself as Ted. This was one of the first times investigators had a name. Bundy's ability to charm and deceive allowed him to evade suspicion. He continued his studies, even attending law school. Outwardly, he dated women, maintained friendships, and volunteered in politics. Yet beneath this mask, his killings escalated. He abducted, raped, and murdered women across multiple states, including Washington, Oregon, Utah, and Colorado. His method was consistent. He lured victims, often at night, assaulted them, and killed them usually by strangulation or bludgeoning. He sometimes revisited the bodies, leaving them in remote wooded areas, and in some cases committing acts of necrophilia. By 1975, Bundy had moved to Utah, and killings began there as well. Local investigators grew alarmed at the pattern. He was eventually arrested that year after police found burglary tools in his car, which also contained suspicious items like handcuffs and a ski mask. At the time, this evidence was not enough for a murder charge, but it marked the beginning of his downfall. Bundy managed to escape custody multiple times, which only added to his infamy. In 1977, while held in Colorado, he leapt from a courthouse library window and fled. He was recaptured, but later that year, he escaped again from his jail cell by squeezing through a hole in the ceiling. He made his way across the country to Florida. In Florida, Bundy unleashed his most brutal attacks. In January 1978, he entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. In the early hours of the morning, he attacked 4 women in their rooms, killing 2 of them, Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman, and severely injuring the others. Only weeks later, he abducted and murdered a 12-year-old girl named Kimberly Leach. These crimes shocked the nation and ended any illusion that Bundy was a man who could restrain himself. His capture came soon after. In February 1978, he was pulled over by police in Pensacola driving a stolen car. Once identified, his face was splashed across newspapers nationwide. The trial that followed was the first to be televised, and millions watched as Bundy attempted to defend himself in court. He cross-examined witnesses and played the role of his own lawyer. His charm and arrogance fascinated the media, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Bite mark analysis tied him to the Chi Omega murders, and witnesses placed him near the scenes. In 1979, Bundy was convicted and sentenced to death. Additional trials followed for the murder of Kimberly Leach, and he received another death sentence. Over the next decade, he lived on death row in Florida, appealing his case and granting interviews. During this time, he confessed to more than 30 murders, though investigators believe the true number may be higher, possibly over 100. Bundy described in chilling detail how he selected and killed his victims. In January 1989, his appeals ran out, and he was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. Outside, the prison crowds gathered, chanting and celebrating the end of his life. For many families, the execution closed a painful chapter, though the scars of loss remain. The legacy of Ted Bundy endures because his crimes revealed how easily appearances can deceive. He was educated, articulate, and outwardly normal, yet beneath that facade lay a predator driven by compulsion. His case led to greater awareness of a need for coordinated police work across states, since Bundy moved freely between jurisdictions. It also highlighted the vulnerability of young women who trusted a stranger in need. Today, Bundy is remembered not only for his crimes, but also for the way society responded to him. The media often portrayed him as charismatic, which drew criticism for humanizing him instead of focusing on the victims. Books, documentaries, and films continue to analyze his life, but at the core remain the stories of the women whose lives were stolen. They were daughters, sisters, and friends who deserve remembrance beyond the shadow of the man who killed them. Bundy's story is one of deception, manipulation, and cruelty wrapped in the mask of normalcy. It endures as a warning that evil can sometimes wear the most ordinary face. Story 3. John Wayne Gacy was born in March 1942 in Chicago, Illinois. He grew up in a working-class family with a father who was an alcoholic and physically abusive. His childhood was marked by fear and insecurity. Though he tried to please his father, nothing ever seemed enough. He suffered from health problems, including a heart condition that limited his activities. These early years shaped a man who longed for acceptance, but carried deep resentment and anger inside. Despite a difficult home life, Gacy worked hard to present himself as normal. In high school, he was not particularly athletic, but he participated in clubs and worked odd jobs. He developed an early interest in politics and community activities. After leaving school, he married and tried to build a stable life. For a time, he seemed successful. He managed several fast food restaurants and became involved in local organizations. His outward personality was friendly and generous. He hosted neighborhood gatherings and was known to dress as a clown named Pogo to entertain children at hospitals and community events. This image of the cheerful neighbor and community volunteer would later stand in sharp contrast to the darkness he hid. Beneath the mask of normalcy, Gacy was leading a double life. He had already faced accusations of assaulting young men in the 1960s while living in Iowa. He was convicted of sexually abusing a teenage boy in 1968 and sentenced to prison. Though he served less than 2 years, he returned to Chicago with a record that should have been a warning. Instead, he managed to rebuild his reputation. He remarried, started his own construction business, and became active in local politics. He was even photographed with prominent politicians. To the public, he was a respected businessman. To those closest to him, there were glimpses of volatility, but few suspected the horror that lay hidden. Gacy's crimes escalated in the early 1970s. He lured young men and boys to his home, often offering them work construction jobs or simply a safe place to hang out. Once inside his modest suburban house, he would overpower them. His method became ritualistic. He used handcuffs, sometimes presenting them as a party trick. After restraining his victims, he would assault, torture, and eventually strangle them. Most of the killings took place in his home while his neighbors remained unaware. The number of victims grew over the years. Gacy buried many of them in the crawl space beneath his house. Others were disposed of in nearby rivers. The smell in the house became overwhelming at times, but Gacy explained it away as plumbing issues. He continued to maintain his outward image of normality, attending parties, working in politics, and performing as Pogo the Clown. The juxtaposition between his community role and his secret life made the eventual revelation all the more shocking. In 1978, his crimes began to unravel. That December, a teenage boy named Robert Pius disappeared after telling friends he was going to meet a contractor about a job. The contractor was John Wayne Gacy. When police began investigating, they quickly connected Gacy to other missing young men. They obtained a search warrant and entered his house. Inside, they found items that belonged to several missing victims. The stench from the crawl space raised immediate suspicions. A second search warrant allowed police to dig beneath the house. What they uncovered was a nightmare. Body after body was exhumed from the crawl space. In total, 29 victims were buried there, with additional remains found in rivers nearby. Many of the victims were teenagers or young men who had simply vanished without explanation. For families who had searched desperately for answers, the discovery was devastating. Gacy was arrested and interrogated. His demeanor shocked investigators. He confessed calmly to more than 30 murders, describing his methods in chilling detail. He admitted that he had sometimes killed 2 victims in a single night. He spoke of the killings as though they were routine parts of his life. His lack of remorse and the sheer scale of his crimes stunned even seasoned detectives. The trial of John Wayne Gacy began in 1980. It attracted enormous attention. Prosecutors laid out the evidence of his double life and the brutality of his murders. The defense attempted to argue insanity, but the jury was unconvinced. The calculated nature of his crimes and his ability to maintain a normal outward life demonstrated that he understood his actions. After only a short deliberation, the jury found him guilty on 33 counts of murder. It was one of the largest conviction totals for a single person in American history at the time. Gacy was sentenced to death. He spent 14 years on death row at Menard Correctional Center in Illinois. During this time, he painted hundreds of portraits, many of them depicting clowns. These paintings were sometimes sold at auctions, sparking controversy. Gacy gave interviews in which he denied responsibility despite his earlier confessions. He claimed he was the victim of a conspiracy. His shifting stories only added to his notoriety. On May 10th, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. Outside, the prison crowds gathered in celebration. For many families, the execution brought some closure, though nothing could restore the lives that were lost. The sheer scale of his crimes left a permanent scar on the communities he had haunted. The case of John Wayne Gacy continues to resonate because of the contrast between his public and private lives. He was the friendly neighbor, the businessman, the clown who entertained children, yet behind closed doors, he was a predator who murdered more than 30 young men. His ability to hide in plain sight exposed flaws in the system and highlighted how vulnerable runaway teens and young workers were in the 1970s. The legacy of Gacy is one of horror and deception. His crimes serve as a reminder that appearances can be misleading and that predators can exist even in the most ordinary neighborhoods. The memory of his victims endures as a testament to lives cut short by a man who wore a mask, both literal and figurative. Behind the smile of a clown lay the heart of a killer. Story 4. The Zodiac Killer is a name that still casts a shadow over the history of American crime. Active in the late 1960s and early 1970s in Northern California, the Zodiac terrorized communities with brutal murders and cryptic letters. Unlike many other killers, his identity was never confirmed, which has only deepened the mystery and fear surrounding the case. The first confirmed attack attributed to the Zodiac occurred on December 20th, 1968, near the small town of Benicia, California. 2 teenagers, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, were on their first date when they parked at a Lover's Lane spot. A car pulled up beside them. The assailant forced them out and shot both of them with a handgun. Betty Lou died instantly, and David was mortally wounded. There was no robbery or clear motive. It seemed a senseless act. Investigators had few leads, and the case went cold. On July 4th, 1969, another couple, Darlene Farron and Mike Mageau, were sitting in a car at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo when a vehicle pulled up. The driver left, then returned and opened fire with a handgun. Darlene was killed, and Mike survived with serious injuries. Just over an hour later, a man called the Vallejo police station claiming responsibility not only for this attack, but also for the previous one on David and Betty Lou. The caller provided details that had not been released publicly. It was the first direct communication from the man who would call himself the Zodiac. Weeks later, newspapers received letters written by the killer. These letters were taunting, filled with strange symbols and coded messages. In one, he introduced himself with the chilling phrase, "This is the Zodiac speaking." He demanded that the letters be published or he would kill more people. Inside the letters were cryptograms that he claimed revealed his identity. One of the first ciphers was cracked by a schoolteacher and his wife. It did not reveal a name, but instead a disturbing message where the killer declared that he enjoyed killing because it was fun. The Zodiac struck again on September 27, 1969 at Lake Berryessa. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were relaxing by the water when a man approached wearing a hood with a crosshair symbol on the chest. He tied them up and stabbed them repeatedly. Brian survived, but Cecilia later died. Before leaving the scene, the attacker scrawled a message on the victim's car door with the dates of his previous attacks and his distinctive crosshair symbol. Only 2 weeks later, on October 11th, 1969, the Zodiac murdered cab driver Paul Stein in San Francisco. He shot him in the head and then bizarrely cut a piece of the victim's shirt to send later with a letter. Witnesses saw the killer at the scene, describing him as a white male in his 30s with glasses. Despite this near miss, the Zodiac managed to escape into the night. Police rushed to the area, but confusion about the suspect's race led officers to let him walk past them. This mistake may have cost them their best chance at capture. Over the following years, the Zodiac continued to send letters to newspapers and police. In them, he mocked investigators, boasted about his crimes, and threatened mass killings. He claimed responsibility for dozens of murders, though only a handful have been definitively linked to him. The letters often included ciphers, some of which remain unsolved to this day. His messages revealed a man who craved attention and control more than anything. He wanted to be feared and to prove that he was smarter than the authorities. The investigation into the Zodiac was massive. Police departments across multiple counties worked together, but cooperation was strained at times. Thousands of tips poured in, and hundreds of suspects were investigated. The most famous suspect was Arthur Lee Allen, a convicted child molester who lived in Vallejo and matched some descriptions. He was interviewed multiple times and even named in a search warrant. Circumstantial evidence pointed toward him, but definitive proof never surfaced. DNA analysis years later did not match him, though doubts and debates remain. As time passed, the Zodiac's letters grew less frequent. His last confirmed correspondence was in 1974. After that, the trail went cold. Some believe he died or was imprisoned for another crime. Others think he simply stopped writing and continued living quietly under a false identity. The lack of closure left victims' families and investigators frustrated. In the decades since the killings, the Zodiac has become part of American folklore. Books, documentaries, and films have kept the story alive. Amateur sleuths have dedicated their lives to decoding his ciphers and piecing together clues. In 2020, a team of codebreakers finally solved one of his unsolved ciphers sent in 1969. The message contained more taunts, but again, no name. This reinforced the idea that the Zodiac never intended to reveal his identity. His goal was to manipulate the public and instill fear. The impact of the Zodiac case was profound. It highlighted the challenges of interagency cooperation in the pre-digital era when communication between counties was slow. It showed how media attention could both aid and hinder investigations. The constant publication of his letters gave him the spotlight he desired, but also kept the public informed. To this day, the identity of the Zodiac remains unproven. DNA analysis offers some hope, but the evidence is limited and degraded by time. Theories abound, ranging from known suspects like Arthur Lee Allen to more obscure figures. Every few years, a new claim emerges about his identity, but none have been confirmed. The story of the Zodiac Killer endures because it combines brutal violence with mystery. Unlike other serial killers who were eventually caught and exposed, the Zodiac remains a ghost figure lurking in the shadows of history. His victims were ordinary people, young couples enjoying evenings by the water, or a cab driver working late at night. Their lives were cut short by a man who wanted to be remembered for terror rather than for who he was. Today, more than 50 years later, the case continues to fascinate because it is unfinished. The unanswered questions leave space for endless speculation. The Zodiac's cryptic symbols remain as haunting reminders of a killer who manipulated fear with both weapons and words. His legacy is not only in the murders he committed, but in the way he exploited mystery itself, turning crime into a dark puzzle that is yet to be solved. Story 5. Richard Ramirez was born in February 1960 in El Paso, Texas. His childhood was marked by instability and violence. His father was strict and often abusive. His mother worked in a factory where exposure to chemicals may have affected her health. Richard grew up surrounded by poverty and dysfunction. From a young age, he was influenced by his older cousin Miguel, who had returned from serving in Vietnam. Miguel boasted about brutal acts he had committed during the war and even showed Richard disturbing photographs of women he claimed to have assaulted. At only 12 years old, Richard witnessed Miguel murder his own wife during a domestic argument. These traumatic experiences left deep scars on the boy, who was already vulnerable. Richard began experimenting with drugs as a teenager, turning to marijuana and later LSD. He also developed a fascination with Satanism and dark rituals. He struggled in school and dropped out early. His petty crimes soon escalated into burglaries. By his early 20s, he had moved to California, drifting through Los Angeles and San Francisco, surviving on theft and immersing himself in a lifestyle of addiction and violence. His descent into murder began in 1984. That June, a 79-year-old woman named Jenny Vincow was found dead in her apartment in Los Angeles. She had been stabbed, and her body showed signs of mutilation. Police had no suspect at the time, but years later this crime was linked to Richard Ramirez. It marked the start of his killing spree. By 1985, the murders escalated dramatically. Ramirez gained the nickname the Night Stalker because he attacked in the middle of the night. He targeted homes across Southern California, breaking in while victims slept. His methods were unpredictable. Sometimes he used a gun, other times a knife or blunt objects. He killed men and women of all ages. He assaulted women and sometimes children. He left satanic symbols at crime scenes and forced victims to swear their loyalty to the devil. The randomness of his attacks created widespread fear because nobody knew who might be next. In March 1985, he attacked Maria Hernandez in her home in Rosemead. She survived by raising her hands and deflecting a bullet. Minutes later, he killed another woman, Tsai, leaving you outside her car nearby. That same evening, he killed a third woman in her apartment. These rapid attacks terrified the city. Newspapers began covering the Night Stalker daily. Over the next months, Ramirez continued his spree. He invaded homes across Los Angeles and beyond, often leaving survivors who could describe his appearance. He was tall, thin, with rotting teeth and a foul odor that witnesses never forgot. His brutality shocked even seasoned detectives. In some cases, he forced couples to witness each other's assaults before killing one or both. He showed no consistent pattern except his desire to terrorize. The police struggled to catch him. At first, the crime seemed unrelated because of the varying weapons and methods. But soon detectives connected the attacks by shoe prints left behind. A distinct sneaker pattern linked multiple scenes. The media reported on this detail, which angered investigators because Ramirez could have changed his shoes to avoid detection. Still, the clue remained vital. By the summer of 1985, his crimes reached a peak. He attacked in San Francisco, killing Peter and Barbara Pan in their home. The mayor of San Francisco publicly revealed that the killer used a .22 caliber handgun. Ramirez read the papers constantly and adjusted his tactics to confuse police. But mistakes piled up. Survivors gave detailed descriptions, and eventually a fingerprint was lifted from a stolen car he abandoned. Police matched it to Richard Ramirez, who already had a record for theft and drug charges. On August 31st, 1985, Ramirez was finally captured, but not by police at first. His photograph had been released to the public, and when he attempted to steal a car in East Los Angeles, he was recognized. Neighbors chased him through the streets and cornered him. The crowd beat him until police arrived to take him into custody. The capture brought relief to a city that had been living in fear for months. The trial of Richard Ramirez became one of the most notorious in American history. It began in 1989 and lasted over a year. The courtroom was often filled with reporters and curious spectators. Ramirez seemed to revel in the attention. He flashed satanic hand signs and shouted "Hail Satan" during proceedings. His gaunt appearance, dark eyes, and defiant attitude made him a figure of morbid fascination. Despite his behavior, the evidence was overwhelming. Survivors testified in detail. Forensic evidence, including fingerprints and ballistic matches, tied him to multiple murders. In September 1989, Ramirez was convicted of 13 murders, as well as numerous counts of assault, burglary, and attempted murder. He was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin prison. Outside the courthouse, crowds cheered the verdict. Families of victims wept both in grief and in relief that justice had been served. On death row, Ramirez continued to attract media attention. He received letters from admirers and even married a woman who believed in his innocence. His presence remained unsettling. Unlike some killers who eventually expressed remorse, he showed none. He continued to speak about Satanism and portrayed himself as an outcast who had embraced evil. Ramirez never faced execution. He remained on death row for more than 2 decades. In June 2013, he died of complications related to cancer at the age of 53. For some, the fact that he died of natural causes rather than execution was frustrating, but his death finally closed the chapter on his life. The legacy of the Night Stalker remains one of pure terror. His crimes were random, cruel, and driven not by need, but by a desire to spread fear. Unlike killers who targeted specific types of victims, Ramirez attacked anyone he encountered. This unpredictability magnified the panic in California communities. People began locking doors, installing new security systems, and staying awake at night terrified that he might strike. His story highlights the vulnerability of ordinary homes and the way one man can paralyze entire cities. The survivors of his attacks continue to carry the memories of those nights. The families of the dead live with the loss of loved ones whose lives were cut short in acts of senseless brutality. Richard Ramirez remains a reminder of the darkest extremes of human behavior. He called himself a servant of Satan, but in reality, he was a predator who preyed on the innocent. His name and the moniker Night Stalker endure in American memory as symbols of fear that once gripped a generation. Story 6. In the quiet rural town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, during the first half of the 20th century, life moved slowly and simply. The community was small, neighbors knew one another, and farms stretched across the flat landscape. Yet behind this peaceful setting there lived a man whose crimes would eventually horrify the entire nation. His name was Edward Theodore Gain. Ed Gain was born in August 1906 to George and Augusta Gain. His father was an alcoholic who struggled to hold steady work, while his mother was deeply religious, domineering, and strict. Augusta instilled in her 2 sons a belief that the world was filled with sin and corruption. She particularly warned them against women, describing them as instruments of immorality. Ed grew up isolated. The family rarely allowed social interaction, and the Gain children were discouraged from making friends. As a child, Ed was shy, quiet, and awkward. He was ridiculed by other children at school, which only pushed him further into isolation. His mother's teachings shaped him profoundly. He developed an unhealthy attachment to Augusta, viewing her as the only pure and trustworthy person in the world. This dependence would define his entire life. In 1940, Ed's father died, leaving the family to survive on farm income. Soon after, his older brother Henry began expressing doubts about their mother's strict worldview. Henry worried about Ed's unhealthy devotion to Augusta, but in 1944 Henry died in a suspicious fire while working on the family property. Although the official cause was listed as asphyxiation, investigators quietly noted that the circumstances were odd. Ed reported the fire, and when Henry's body was found it appeared not badly burned, leading some to wonder if Ed had played a role in his brother's death. After Henry's passing, Ed was left alone with his mother. But only a year later, in 1945, Augusta herself died following a series of strokes. Her death devastated Ed. He had lost the one person who dominated his world and provided structure to his life. Without her guidance, he became reclusive, retreating into the farmhouse that grew increasingly filthy and cluttered. Most rooms were left untouched as shrines to Augusta, kept exactly as she had left them, while Ed confined himself to a few areas filled with debris and decay. It was in this lonely environment that Ed's obsession with death and the human body began to take its most disturbing form. He frequently visited cemeteries at night, digging up recently buried bodies. He removed skin, bones, and organs, taking them back to his farmhouse where he fashioned grotesque trophies. Investigators later discovered masks made of human skin, bowls crafted from skulls, and furniture upholstered with human hides. These creations suggested that Ed was attempting to recreate his mother's presence or even become her by wearing the skin of women he exhumed. For many years, his macabre activities went unnoticed. Plainfield was a small, trusting community, and Ed was seen as odd but harmless. He worked odd jobs, babysat for neighbors, and was known for being polite though strange. That perception changed in November 1957 when Bernice Wardens, the local hardware store owner, disappeared. Her store was found locked with bloodstains on the floor. A receipt showed that Ed Gain had been her last customer that day. Police obtained a search warrant and went to Ed's farmhouse. What they found shocked even the most experienced officers. Inside the house were the remains of Bernice Wardens. Her body had been hung in a shed and gutted like a deer. As investigators searched further, they uncovered the horrific collection of human remains Ed had gathered over the years. Masks of human faces hung on the walls. Chairs were covered in human skin, and boxes contained organs. Some remains were traced back to missing women, though Ed admitted many came from graves he had robbed. The discoveries horrified the public. The idea that a quiet, seemingly harmless neighbor had been committing such grotesque acts shattered the sense of safety in small-town America. Newspapers across the country printed the details, and Ed Gain quickly became infamous. His crimes went beyond murder into a realm of depravity rarely seen. During interrogation, Ed confessed to killing Bernice Wardens and another local woman, tavern owner Mary Hogan, who had vanished in 1954. He also admitted to robbing graves, but claimed he had not killed most of the women whose remains were found in his house. His statements revealed a disturbed mind. He described entering trances when digging up bodies, and he explained how he crafted clothing and masks in an effort to transform himself into his mother. In 1958, Ed Gain was found mentally incompetent to stand trial and was committed to a psychiatric institution. For more than a decade, he remained there until doctors declared him fit for trial. In 1968, he was tried for the murder of Bernice Wardens. He was found guilty but insane, leading to his return to a mental hospital where he spent the remainder of his life. He died in 1984 at the age of 77. The case of Ed Gain left a lasting legacy not only in true crime history, but also in popular culture. His crimes inspired some of the most iconic horror characters in cinema, including Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. His story raised questions about mental illness, isolation, and the dangers of unchecked obsession. For the people of Plainfield, the scars never fully healed. The town became associated with darkness it never asked for. Many locals avoided speaking about Ed Gain for decades, wishing to move past the horror. Yet the farmhouse where he committed his crimes became a site of morbid curiosity until it was eventually burned down. Ed Gein remains a figure of fascination because his crimes blurred the line between reality and nightmare. He was not the typical killer driven by greed or impulse. Instead, he was a man shaped by isolation, dominated by his mother, and consumed by fantasies that grew more grotesque after her death. His actions shock a nation because they revealed what can emerge from loneliness and obsession left unchecked. Even today, his story is studied in criminal psychology as an example of how trauma, control, and mental illness can twist a life into something almost unimaginable. Behind every horror film inspired by his deeds is the reminder that these terrors were once real in a small Wisconsin town where people thought they knew their neighbors.